In 1692, Salem, Massachusetts became America's darkest town. It started with two young girls having fits. Within months, over 200 people were accused of witchcraft. 20 were executed. One man was crushed to death under heavy stones. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Children testified against their parents. And it all began with a lie. For the next 3 hours, witness the complete story of the Salem Witch Trials, from the first accusations in January 1692 to the final hangings in September. This is the Dark History of Salem, perfect for a Halloween night. Salem before the madness. The year was 1692. The place was Salem Village, a small Puritan settlement in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. To understand how this community descended into madness, we must first understand what Salem was before the darkness came. Salem Village was not Salem Town. This distinction would prove important in the months to come. Salem Town was a prosperous port on the Atlantic coast, where merchants grew wealthy from trade with the West Indies and Europe. Ships arrived carrying sugar, molasses, rum, and sometimes human cargo in the form of enslaved people. Salem Town had money, influence, and a cosmopolitan air that came from contact with the wider world. Salem Village, by contrast, was a farming community approximately 5 miles inland from the port. It was established in 1672 as a parish of Salem Town, and this subordinate status created resentment that simmered beneath the surface of daily life. The farmers of Salem Village felt they paid too much in taxes to Salem Town and received too little in return. They wanted their own church, their own minister, their own identity separate from the wealthy merchants who looked down on them as country folk. By 1692, Salem Village had won the right to have its own meeting house and minister, but the community remained fractured. Some families wanted complete independence from Salem Town. Others maintained loyalty to the port and its Puritan establishment. These factions would play a crucial role in the witch trials, as accusations often followed the fault lines of these old disputes. The physical landscape of Salem Village was harsh and unforgiving. The Massachusetts winter of 1691 and 1692 was particularly brutal. Snow fell heavy and deep. The wind howled through gaps in wooden houses that were never quite warm enough. Fires had to be constantly tended. Food stores from the previous harvest had to be carefully rationed to last until spring planting could begin. The Puritans who inhabited Salem Village lived according to a strict interpretation of Protestant Christianity. They believed that God controlled every aspect of existence, from the largest cosmic events to the smallest details of daily life. When something good happened, it was God's blessing. When something bad happened, it might be God's punishment for sin, or it might be the work of the devil. And the Puritans believed absolutely in the devil. He was not an abstract concept or a metaphor for evil. He was a real entity, as real as any person, with plans and purposes and the ability to act in the physical world. The devil wanted souls, and he would use any means necessary to claim them. The Bible was clear on this point. Exodus chapter 22, verse 18 stated, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." A witch was someone who had made a pact with the devil, trading their soul for supernatural powers. These powers allowed witches to harm their neighbors through invisible means. A witch could make a cow stop giving milk, cause a child to sicken and die, or strike a healthy man with mysterious pains. A witch could appear to someone in spectral form, tormenting them while their physical body remained elsewhere, providing a seemingly perfect alibi. The Puritans believed that witches were real, that they lived among normal people disguised as good Christians, and that rooting them out was a sacred duty. This belief was not unique to Salem, or even to New England. Witch trials had occurred throughout Europe for centuries. Tens of thousands of people, mostly women, had been executed for witchcraft in Germany, France, Scotland, England, and elsewhere. The famous witch trials in Salem were actually late examples of a phenomenon that was already declining in Europe by the 1690s. But in Salem Village in the winter of 1692, belief in witchcraft was absolute and unquestioned. The Puritans lived in a world where the supernatural was simply natural, where invisible forces constantly battled for control of human souls, where the line between the physical world and the spiritual world was thin and easily crossed. Into this world of rigid belief, bitter factionalism, harsh weather, and grinding poverty, something strange was about to emerge. It would begin in the household of Reverend Samuel Parris, the minister of Salem Village, a man who had his own reasons for wanting to prove his worth to his fractious congregation. Samuel Parris was born in London in 1653 and raised in Barbados, where his father was a planter. After his father's death, Parris inherited property in Barbados, but struggled to make the plantation profitable. He eventually sold his holdings and moved to Boston, where he became a merchant. When that venture also failed, he turned to the ministry, a profession that offered stability if not wealth. In 1689, Parris was hired as the minister of Salem Village, but the appointment was controversial from the start. Some villagers questioned his qualifications. Others objected to the generous compensation package he demanded, which included ownership of the parsonage and its surrounding land. These disputes meant that Parris was never officially ordained, and his salary was often paid late or not at all. By the winter of 1692, Reverend Parris was a man under pressure, desperate to prove his value to a congregation that seemed perpetually dissatisfied with him. Parris lived in the parsonage with his wife Elizabeth, his 9-year-old daughter Betty, his 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams, and 2 enslaved people he had brought with him from Barbados, a man named John Indian and a woman named Tituba. Tituba's husband, John Indian, worked odd jobs around the village, but Tituba worked in the Parris household, cooking, cleaning, and caring for the children. The winter of 1692 was long and boring for the young girls of Salem Village. Puritan children were not encouraged to play. Play was seen as frivolous, a waste of time that should be spent in prayer, Bible study, or useful work. And children were expected to behave like miniature adults, somber and serious at all times. But children are children, regardless of what adults expect, and Betty Parris and Abigail Williams wanted something more than the dreary routine of winter in the parsonage. They were not alone in this desire. Other girls from the village began to gather at the parsonage, possibly with Tituba's supervision. The group included Ann Putnam Jr., age 12, the daughter of one of the village's most prominent families. Elizabeth Hubbard, age 17, lived with her great-uncle and aunt, Dr. William Griggs and his wife. Mercy Lewis, age 19, was a servant in the household of Thomas Putnam. Mary Walcott, age 16, was the daughter of Captain Jonathan Walcott. Mary Warren, age 20, was a servant in the household of John and Elizabeth Proctor. What exactly these girls did during their gatherings is not entirely clear from the historical record. Some accounts suggest they engaged in fortune-telling, trying to divine who they would marry by dropping an egg white into a glass of water and interpreting the shapes it formed. Such activities would have been considered sinful by Puritan standards, dabbling in the occult, even if the participants viewed it as harmless fun. Other accounts suggest that Tituba told the girls stories from her childhood in Barbados or from Carib indigenous traditions, tales of spirits and magic that must have seemed exotic and thrilling compared to the stern sermons the girls heard every Sunday in the meeting house. Whether Tituba actually practiced any form of Caribbean folk magic is unknown and unprovable from this distance in time, but later testimony would claim she did, and these claims would have devastating consequences. What we know for certain is that in January 1692, Betty Parris and Abigail Williams began to behave strangely. They would fall into trances, staring into space and not responding when spoken to. They would suddenly scream or cry out. They would contort their bodies into unusual positions, arching their backs or twisting their limbs in ways that seemed impossible. They would make choking sounds as if being strangled by invisible hands. They would dive under furniture and scramble on all fours like animals. Reverend Parris was alarmed by this behavior. He prayed over the girls. He consulted with other ministers from nearby communities. He called in Dr. William Griggs to examine them. Dr. Griggs could find no physical cause for the afflictions. After ruling out all natural explanations, the doctor offered a diagnosis that would change Salem forever. The girls, he said, were under the influence of witchcraft. This diagnosis opened a door that could not be closed. If the girls were bewitched, then someone in Salem Village must be a witch. The question was, who? At first, the girls would not or could not say who was tormenting them. They continued to have fits, and now other girls began to show similar symptoms. Ann Putnam Jr. started having visions of specters, the invisible spirits of witches that only she could see. The afflictions were spreading like an invisible contagion through the community. pressure mounted on Betty Paris and Abigail Williams to reveal the names of their tormentors. Reverend Paris questioned them repeatedly. Other adults in the community urged them to speak. In a Puritan society where children were taught never to lie, where bearing false witness was a grave sin, the girls finally gave names. They accused 3 women, Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. These were not random choices. Each of the accused women was marginal to Salem village society, vulnerable in different ways, unlikely to receive the benefit of the doubt from their neighbors. Sarah Good was a homeless beggar who went door to door asking for food and shelter. She was married to William Good, but they were desperately poor, often sleeping in barns or other people's homes when charity was offered. Sarah Good had a reputation for muttering under her breath when turned away, and some villagers believed these mutterings were curses. She smoked a pipe, which was considered unseemly for a woman. She was pregnant with her second child, but poverty had made her gaunt and ragged, older than her years. Sarah Osborne was a wealthy woman by Salem village standards, but she had scandalized the community by marrying her indentured servant after her first husband died, and she rarely attended church services due to illness. She was involved in a legal dispute over her late husband's property, battling against the Putnam family, one of the most powerful families in the village. Sarah Osborne's refusal to conform to community expectations made her an easy target. And then there was Tituba, an enslaved woman from Barbados, an outsider by virtue of her race and her origins, someone who spoke with an accent and came from a place of heat and sugar and tropical strangeness utterly foreign to the frozen landscape of Massachusetts. If anyone in Salem Village seemed capable of exotic and dangerous magic, it was Tituba. On February 29th, 1692, arrest warrants were issued for Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. They would be examined the following day at Ingersoll's Tavern by local magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin. These men were not neutral judges seeking truth. They were interrogators convinced of the prisoner's guilt, determined to extract confessions. The examinations began, and what happened next would shock everyone in Salem Village, because one of the accused women would confess to witchcraft, and her confession would transform 3 isolated accusations into the largest witch hunt in American history. The stage was set. The accusations had been made, and Salem Village was about to descend into a nightmare from which it would not awaken for 8 long months. Winter 1692. The strange afflictions begin. The examinations of Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba took place on March 1st, 1692, at Ingersoll's Tavern in Salem Village. The tavern was packed with spectators. Word had spread quickly about the witchcraft accusations, and everyone wanted to see the accused women and witness their interrogations. The crowd was so large that the proceedings had to be moved to the Salem Village Meeting House to accommodate everyone. The atmosphere was charged with fear and excitement. Many in the audience had never seen a suspected witch before. They stared at the 3 women with a mixture of horror and fascination, looking for signs of diabolical evil in their faces and bearing. The magistrates, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, sat at a table at the front of the meeting house. They were both wealthy merchants from Salem town, men of authority and respect. Hathorne was particularly aggressive in his questioning, already convinced of the prisoner's guilt before a single word of testimony had been heard. His approach was not to investigate whether these women were witches, but to make them confess that they were. The afflicted girls sat in prominent positions where everyone could see them. Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, Ann Putnam Jr., and the others would serve as living evidence of witchcraft. Whenever one of the accused women moved or spoke, the girls would react, crying out in pain or falling into fits, as if the witch's actions were causing them immediate harm. Sarah Good was examined first. She was brought before the magistrates, dirty and disheveled from her night in custody, her pregnant belly obvious beneath her ragged clothes. "Sarah Good, what evil spirit have you familiarity with?" Hathorne demanded. "None," Sarah Good replied. "Have you made no contract with the devil?" "No!" Hathorne pressed harder. "Why do you hurt these children?" "I do not hurt them," Sarah Good said. "I scorn it." But even as she spoke, the afflicted girls began to scream and writhe. They pointed at Sarah Good and cried out that her specter was pinching them, biting them, choking them. The magistrates could see no specter, and neither could anyone else in the meeting house except the afflicted girls. This was spectral evidence, testimony that an invisible spirit was causing harm, evidence that would become the foundation of the Salem Witch Trials. "Who do you employ then to hurt them?" Hathorne asked, trying to trap Sarah Good into naming accomplices. "I employ nobody," Sarah Good insisted. "What creature do you employ then?" "No creature. I am falsely accused." Hathorne changed tactics. He asked Sarah Good about her muttering, the habit that had made her neighbors suspicious. "What is it you say when you go muttering away from persons' houses?" Sarah Good replied that she was merely reciting a psalm, a prayer from the Bible. Hathorne ordered her to recite it. She could not remember the exact words. This failure was taken as evidence of guilt. A true Christian would know their psalms perfectly. A witch who claimed to be praying but was actually cursing would fumble the words. Sarah Good's own husband, William Good, was called to testify. Hathorne asked him if he believed his wife was a witch. William Good said he was afraid she either was a witch or would be one. He reported that she had bad carriage, a Puritan term meaning poor behavior or evil character. He also mentioned, almost casually, that he had noticed strange marks on his wife's body, marks that might be witches' teats, unnatural growths that a witch would use to suckle her familiar spirits, the demons that served her. This testimony from her own husband was devastating. Sarah Good was taken away and held for trial. The magistrates were satisfied that they had found their first witch, though she had not confessed. Next came Sarah Osborne. She was brought into the meeting house, a middle-aged woman visibly weakened by illness. Unlike Sarah Good, who was defiant, Sarah Osborne seemed confused and frightened. "What evil spirit have you familiarity with?" Hathorne asked. "None," Sarah Osborne said. "Have you made no contract with the devil?" "No, I never saw the devil in my life." Hathorne asked why she hurt the children. Sarah Osborne denied it. The afflicted girls immediately went into fits, screaming that Sarah Osborne's specter was attacking them. Ann Putnam Jr. cried out that she could see Sarah Osborne's specter, and a strange creature with the head of a woman, the body of a bird, and wings. This creature, Anne said, was a familiar spirit serving Sarah Osborne. Sarah Osborne tried to explain her innocence. She said she herself had been frightened by something strange recently. She had experienced what she called a nightmare, though she used the Old English meaning of the word, which referred to a demon that sat on the chest of a sleeping person, causing a sensation of suffocation. Sarah Osborne described feeling a weight on her chest and seeing an Indian-like creature, half woman and half animal, that pinched her and tried to harm her. She suggested that perhaps this same evil spirit that had afflicted her was now afflicting the girls, and she was being falsely blamed for its actions. This explanation did not help her. The magistrates interpreted her account as an admission that she had contact with evil spirits. Sarah Osborne's attempt to describe her own victimization was twisted into evidence of her guilt. She too was taken away and held for trial. Then came Tituba. Of the three accused women, she was in the most vulnerable position. As an enslaved woman, she had no legal rights and no protection. Her owner, Reverend Paris, could punish her however he wished. There is evidence that Paris had already beaten Tituba to make her confess before the examination even began. Whether from fear of further beatings, a genuine belief that confession would save her life, or some other motivation lost to history, Tituba did something that neither Sarah Good nor Sarah Osborne had done. She confessed, and her confession was spectacular. "The devil came to me," Tituba said, "and bid me serve him." The meeting house went silent. Everyone leaned forward to hear more. Hathorne and Corwin exchanged glances. They had their witch. Now they needed details. Tituba described seeing the devil appear to her. Sometimes he looked like a man, she said, dressed in black. Sometimes he appeared as an animal, a great black dog or a hog. He had shown her a book and demanded that she sign it with her blood. She had resisted at first, she claimed, but eventually she had signed. In the devil's book, she said, there were 9 names, 9 witches in Salem. This revelation sent shockwaves through the audience. 9 witches. That meant there were 6 more beyond the 3 who had been arrested. 6 more witches hiding in Salem Village, pretending to be normal Christians while secretly serving Satan. Tituba continued her confession. She said that Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were also witches. She said they had all flown through the air together to commit acts of witchcraft. She described how they tormented the afflicted girls, sending their specters to pinch and choke and terrorize them. The afflicted girls corroborated every word Tituba said. They pointed and cried out that, yes, they could see what Tituba was describing. They could see the specters and the animal familiars. The invisible world was becoming visible through their testimony. Tituba gave the magistrates everything they wanted: a confession, descriptions of diabolical activities, and most importantly, the assurance that there were more witches to be found. Her testimony validated the fears of everyone in Salem Village. Witchcraft was real. It was happening here and now, and there were still 6 unnamed witches lurking among them. The examinations concluded. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were sent to Boston to be held in prison until trial. Tituba, despite her confession, was also sent to prison. In the legal logic of the time, a confessed witch was still a witch and needed to be held until she could stand trial and potentially provide more information about her accomplices. But the danger had not passed. The afflictions continued. Betty Paris and Abigail Williams and the others still had fits. They still saw specters. And now they began to name new witches. In the days following the first examinations, the accusations spread. On March 12th, Martha Corey was accused. Unlike Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, Martha Corey was a respectable member of the church, a woman who attended services regularly and was known for her piety. Her accusation sent shockwaves through Salem Village. If Martha Corey could be a witch, then anyone could be a witch. Ann Putnam Jr. claimed that Martha Corey's specter had appeared to her and tried to force her to sign the devil's book. The girl said the specter had bitten and pinched her. Other afflicted girls supported Ann's testimony. They all saw Martha Corey's specter tormenting them. Martha Corey was arrested and examined on March 21st. She handled her interrogation poorly, making statements that the magistrates interpreted as mockery. When asked about the afflicted girls' fits, she seemed to dismiss them as fraudulent, suggesting the girls were lying or deluded. This skepticism about the reality of the afflictions made her seem even more guilty in the eyes of Hathorne and Corwin. Why would an innocent person question the testimony of the victims unless she herself was the witch causing their suffering? During Martha Corey's examination, something dramatic happened. The afflicted girls claimed that whatever physical action Martha Corey took, they felt the same action inflicted on their own bodies by her specter. If Martha bit her lip, the girls screamed that her specter was biting them. If Martha clasped her hands together, the girls said their hands were being forced together by an invisible force. This synchronized suffering was taken as irrefutable proof of Martha Corey's guilt. Martha Corey was sent to prison to await trial. The same day that Martha Corey was examined, another woman was accused, Rebecca Nurse. And with Rebecca Nurse's accusation, the true horror of the Salem Witch Trials became apparent. Rebecca Nurse was 71 years old, a beloved grandmother, deeply religious, known throughout the community as a model of Christian virtue. She was hard of hearing and physically frail, requiring a cane to walk. She had been ill recently and was bedridden when the constable arrived at her home with the warrant for her arrest. The news of Rebecca Nurse's accusation divided Salem Village. Many people simply could not believe that such a godly woman could be a witch. When she was examined on March 24th, the meeting house was once again packed, but this time there were many in the audience who supported Rebecca Nurse and believed in her innocence. Rebecca Nurse maintained her innocence throughout the examination. "I am innocent as the child unborn," she said. "I have never hurt a child in my life." But the afflicted girls testified that they saw her specter tormenting them. Ann Putnam Jr. claimed that Rebecca Nurse's specter had appeared to her and tried to persuade her to join the witches. The other girls fell into fits, screaming and convulsing whenever Rebecca Nurse moved or spoke. The examination of Rebecca Nurse was more restrained than previous examinations. Even Hathorne seemed troubled by the accusation against such a pious woman. He gave her more opportunity to defend herself than he had given Sarah Good or Martha Corey. But in the end, the spectral evidence was considered decisive. The afflicted girls said they saw her specter. Therefore, she must be a witch. Rebecca Nurse was sent to prison. Her arrest galvanized opposition to the witch trials. 39 members of the community signed a petition testifying to Rebecca Nurse's good character. This was an extraordinary act of collective courage in a climate of fear where defending an accused witch might lead to accusations of witchcraft oneself. But the petition did not stop the proceedings. The accusations continued. More names were being called, more specters were being seen. The witch hunt was accelerating, and no one in Salem Village was safe. By the end of March 1692, 6 people had been arrested for witchcraft: Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, Tituba, Martha Corey, Rebecca Nurse, and Rebecca Nurse's sister, Sarah Cloyce, who made the mistake of walking out of church during a sermon that seemed to condemn her sister, an act interpreted as a sign of guilt. The number of afflicted individuals was also growing. More girls and young women were having visions and fits. Adults began to report afflictions as well. The invisible world of spirits and specters seemed to be invading Salem Village, and the only defense was to identify and arrest the witches responsible. In April, the accusations intensified. The afflicted girls named Elizabeth Proctor and her husband John Proctor. This was significant because it was one of the first times a man was accused. John Proctor was a wealthy tavern owner, a blunt-spoken man who had expressed skepticism about the witch trials. He had called the afflicted girls liars and suggested they deserved a whipping for making false accusations. Now, those same girls accused him of witchcraft, and his outspoken opposition to the trials was interpreted as evidence that he was trying to protect himself and other witches from exposure. The Proctors were arrested and examined. Elizabeth Proctor was pregnant, which would save her life for a time. Puritan law forbade executing a pregnant woman, since that would mean killing an innocent unborn child. But John Proctor had no such protection. His fate would rest solely on the trial's outcome. More arrests followed. Giles Corey, Martha Corey's husband, was accused. Bridget Bishop, a tavern keeper with a reputation for dressing in bright colors and operating a rowdy establishment, was accused. Mary Warren, one of the Proctor's servants and one of the original afflicted girls, was accused when she began to suggest that the accusations might be false. This last case was particularly revealing. Mary Warren had been one of the accusers, one of the afflicted girls seeing specters and having fits. But after spending time in the Proctor household, where John Proctor insisted the whole affair was fraudulent, Mary Warren began to waver. She suggested that the girls had been lying, that they had not really seen specters, that the fits were fake. Immediately, the other afflicted girls turned on her. They accused Mary Warren of being a witch. They said her specter was tormenting them. Mary Warren was arrested. Under intense pressure during her examination, surrounded by the screaming fits of her former friends, Mary Warren recanted her recantation. She admitted she had been lying when she said the girls were lying. She confirmed that yes, she had seen specters. Yes, she had been afflicted. And yes, there were witches in Salem. She was released but remained under suspicion, her testimony now thoroughly compromised. By the end of April 1692, the prisons in Salem, Boston, and Ipswich held dozens of accused witches. The colonial government in Boston watched the situation with growing concern. Something had to be done. The accused could not remain in prison indefinitely without trial, but the normal court system was not equipped to handle witchcraft cases, which involve spectral evidence and testimony about the invisible world. A special court would need to be created, a court specifically designed to try witchcraft cases, and that court, when it finally convened in June, would send 19 people to the gallows and 1 man to death by crushing in less than 4 months. But before the trials could begin, more accusations would be made. The witch hunt was still growing, still spreading, still reaching higher and higher into the social structure of Massachusetts Bay Colony, and the people of Salem Village watched and wondered, who would be accused next? Tituba's confession. The slave who started it all. Tituba's confession on March 1st, 1692, was the spark that ignited the Salem witch hunt into a raging inferno. Her testimony gave the magistrates and the community exactly what they feared most: confirmation that witchcraft was real, active, and widespread in Salem Village. But who was Tituba? And why did she confess when the other 2 accused women maintained their innocence? The historical record tells us frustratingly little about Tituba's life before Salem. She was enslaved by Samuel Parris, brought from Barbados when he moved to Massachusetts in 1680. Some early accounts described her as Indian, others as Negro, and some modern historians believe she may have been of mixed indigenous South American and African heritage. Barbados, in the late 17th century, was a brutal slave society where enslaved people were worked to death on sugar plantations, and the population included Africans, indigenous peoples from South America, captured and sold into slavery, and people of mixed heritage. What we know for certain is that Tituba had no power, no rights, and no protection under the law. She was property. Samuel Parris owned her completely. If he wanted to beat her, he could. If he wanted to sell her, he could. If he wanted to kill her, he would face minimal legal consequences. When Betty Parris and Abigail Williams first began having fits in January 1692, Tituba was immediately suspect. She was the most foreign person in the household, the most exotic, the most associated with places and practices that seemed mysterious and potentially diabolical to the Puritans of Salem Village. When pressure mounted to identify who was bewitching the girls, Tituba was an obvious target. There is evidence that Reverend Parris beat Tituba before her examination, trying to force a confession from her. Whether this is true or not, Tituba certainly understood the danger she was in. She had seen what happened to enslaved people who displeased their masters. She had lived her entire life under the threat of violence. So when Tituba stood before the magistrates on March 1st, she made a decision that would save her life and doom dozens of others. She told them what they wanted to hear. "The devil came to me and bid me serve him," Tituba said. The room fell silent. This was the first confession of witchcraft in Salem, and it was exactly what the magistrates hoped to extract. John Hathorne leaned forward. "Who have you seen with the devil?" he asked. Tituba named Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. She said they were witches too, and they had all met together with the devil. This mutual accusation between the three arrested women seemed to confirm that a conspiracy of witches was operating in Salem Village. "What is the appearance of the devil when he comes to you?" Hathorne asked. Tituba described the devil in vivid detail. Sometimes he appeared as a man dressed all in black. Sometimes he came as a tall man from Boston. Other times he took the form of animals, a great black dog, a red cat, a yellow bird, or a hog. These animal forms were understood to be familiar spirits, demons that served witches and helped them carry out their evil work. "Did you see Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne with the devil?" Hathorne pressed. "Yes," Tituba said. "They hurt the children. I saw them." Hathorne asked how the witches hurt the children. Tituba described supernatural attacks. She said Sarah Good's specter had a yellow bird that sucked between her fingers, a reference to the belief that witches fed their familiar spirits with their own blood through unnatural growths on their bodies. She said Sarah Osborne had a creature with the head of a woman, 2 legs and wings, which she sent to torment the afflicted girls. The magistrates asked about the devil's book. Tituba confirmed that the devil had shown her a book and demanded that she sign it. She said she had seen 9 marks in the book, 9 names written in red, which meant 9 witches had signed their souls over to Satan. She claimed she could not read well enough to identify all the names, but she recognized Sarah Good's mark and Sarah Osborne's mark. 9 witches. This was the most terrifying part of Tituba's testimony. It meant that only 3 witches had been caught. 6 more were still hidden in the community, still active, still dangerous. Hathorne asked Tituba to describe the witches' meetings. She said the devil had told her to hurt the children. He had shown her how to do it, pinching and choking them with invisible hands. She said the witches flew through the air to their meetings, transported by demonic power. She described seeing Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne riding on sticks or poles, flying like the witches in European folklore. Throughout Tituba's testimony, the afflicted girls confirmed everything she said. When she described seeing specters, they said yes, they saw the same specters. When she described the devil's creatures, they said yes, they saw the creatures too. The testimony of Tituba and the afflicted girls reinforced each other, creating a narrative that seemed unassailable. Tituba's examination continued over multiple sessions. Each time she was questioned, she added new details. She described how the devil had threatened her, telling her he would kill her if she did not obey. She said she had been frightened and reluctant, but the devil was too powerful to resist. This portrayal of herself as a victim forced into witchcraft, rather than a willing participant, was a clever strategy that would ultimately save her life. Tituba also added a crucial detail in her later testimony. She said the devil had told her he had more witches working for him in Boston and other parts of Massachusetts. This suggested that the witch conspiracy was not limited to Salem Village, but extended throughout the colony, a revelation that sent shockwaves through the Puritan leadership. The magistrates were satisfied with Tituba's confession. They had concrete details about the devil's activities, descriptions of diabolical rituals, and confirmation that more witches needed to be found. Tituba was sent to prison along with Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, but her fate would be very different from theirs. Sarah Osborne would never stand trial. She died in prison on May 10, 1692, after months of confinement in miserable conditions. Her death was recorded matter-of-factly in the records, just another casualty of the witch hunt. Sarah Good would eventually stand trial, be convicted, and hanged on July 19, 1692. Before her execution, she would curse Reverend Nicholas Noyes, one of the ministers who condemned her, telling him, "You are a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." This curse became famous in Salem folklore, especially after Noyes died many years later of a hemorrhage that caused him to choke on his own blood. But Tituba, who confessed to witchcraft and described elaborate dealings with the devil, would never be tried. She remained in prison for 13 months until April 1693, when the witch trials had ended and the colony was trying to forget the whole affair. Samuel Parris refused to pay the prison fees required to release her, essentially abandoning her. She was eventually sold to a new owner who paid her fees, and she disappears from the historical record after that. Whether she lived or died, whether she found freedom or remained enslaved until her death, we do not know. Tituba's confession had profound effects on the Salem Witch Trials. First, it validated the belief that witchcraft was real and active in Salem. The magistrates and ministers had suspected witchcraft, but Tituba's detailed confession seemed to prove it beyond doubt. Second, her testimony established the legal framework for spectral evidence. If witches could send their specters to torment people while their physical bodies remained elsewhere, then the testimony of the afflicted about what they saw in the invisible world became the primary evidence in witchcraft cases. This made witchcraft almost impossible to defend against. How could you prove you had not sent your specter somewhere when the accusers claimed they saw it with their own eyes? Third, Tituba's claim that 9 witches had signed the Devil's Book created an imperative to find the remaining 6. The witch hunt could not end until all the witches were caught. Every time a new person was accused and arrested, the magistrates believed they were getting closer to rooting out the entire conspiracy. Fourth, Tituba's portrayal of herself as a reluctant witch, forced into service by the devil's threats, established a template for other accused witches who chose to confess. Those who confessed and cooperated with the magistrates were more likely to be spared execution, at least temporarily, because they were seen as valuable sources of information about other witches. Those who maintained their innocence were seen as hardened witches who refused to repent and therefore deserved death. The irony is stark. The one woman who confessed to witchcraft and gave detailed testimony about serving the devil was the one woman who was never executed. Meanwhile, those who insisted on their innocence were hanged as unrepentant witches. Tituba's confession also reflected the cultural collision at the heart of the Salem Witch Trials. She was a woman from Barbados, a place of heat and sugar plantations and racial mixing and folk beliefs that seemed alien and dangerous to the Puritans. When she described the devil and his creatures, she may have been drawing on Caribbean or indigenous spiritual traditions, translating them into terms the Puritans would understand as diabolical. Or she may have simply been telling the magistrates what she knew they wanted to hear, inventing details based on European witch folklore she had learned from the Puritans themselves. We cannot know what Tituba truly believed. We cannot know whether she actually practiced any form of folk magic, or whether she was entirely innocent of any occult activities. What we know is that she was a powerless woman caught in a terrifying situation, and she survived by giving her accusers the story they demanded. In the years after the Salem Witch Trials, Tituba's role was exaggerated and distorted. Some accounts portrayed her as the primary instigator of the trials, claiming she had taught the girls voodoo or other Caribbean magic, corrupting them into witchcraft. These accounts often reflected racial prejudices, making the foreign slave woman the scapegoat for a tragedy that was actually caused by the fears and beliefs of the Puritan community itself. The truth is more complex and more tragic. Tituba was not the cause of the Salem Witch Trials. The trials were caused by a belief system that saw witches everywhere, a community riven by factions and resentments, a legal system that accepted spectral evidence, and a group of girls whose accusations were believed without question. Tituba was caught in this system, and she did what she had to do to survive. But her confession opened the floodgates. After Tituba testified, more accusations followed rapidly. The magistrates and ministers were convinced they were facing a vast conspiracy of witches. They believed they were fighting a war against Satan himself. And in war, extreme measures are justified. The people of Salem Village were terrified. If 9 witches had signed the devil's book, then 9 people they knew and trusted were secretly servants of evil. Any neighbor, any friend, any family member could be a witch in disguise. The social fabric of the community began to tear apart as suspicion and fear spread like a plague. And the afflicted girls, who had started this crisis with their fits and accusations, found themselves at the center of attention. Adults listened to them with an intensity they had probably never experienced before. The normally strict Puritan society, which demanded children be seen and not heard, was now hanging on every word these girls spoke. They had power, perhaps for the first time in their young lives, and that power would corrupt them and lead them to accuse more and more people as the weeks turned into months. The stage was set for the trials to come. The legal machinery was being prepared, and the people named in Tituba's testimony and in the visions of the afflicted girls were being rounded up and thrown into prison to await their fate. Salem Village in the spring of 1692 was a community in the grip of mass hysteria. The witch hunt was no longer about 3 marginal women who could be easily dismissed. It had spread to respectable church members like Martha Corey and Rebecca Nurse. It would soon reach even higher, to wealthy merchants, to ministers, to people of influence and power. And before it ended, it would claim 20 lives and destroy the reputations of hundreds more. Tituba had opened the door to the invisible world, and through that door came specters and demons and accusations that would not stop until the last execution in September 1692. The accusations spread, from 3 to 200. After Tituba's confession in early March, the witch hunt in Salem accelerated with terrifying speed. What had begun with 3 accused women expanded to encompass more than 200 people by the time the trials ended in September 1692. The accusations spread like wildfire through Salem Village, then Salem Town, then the surrounding communities of Andover, Topsfield, Gloucester, and beyond. How did 3 accusations become 200? The answer lies in the nature of spectral evidence and the psychology of mass hysteria. The afflicted girls continued to have visions. They saw specters everywhere, tormenting them day and night. And now, emboldened by the authorities' belief in their testimony, they began to name more and more people as witches. The magistrates encouraged this, constantly asking the girls who was afflicting them, pressing them to identify every witch so the community could be cleansed of evil. The pattern of accusations followed predictable lines. The accused were often people who were already marginal or controversial in their communities. They were people who had offended others, who were involved in property disputes, who had spoken critically of the trials, or who simply had reputations for being disagreeable or different. But as the trials progressed, the accusations also struck people who seemed beyond reproach. Pillars of the community whose arrests shocked everyone and demonstrated that no one was safe. In early April, Elizabeth Proctor and her husband John Proctor were accused. The Proctors owned a tavern and several hundred acres of land, making them wealthy by Salem Village standards. John Proctor was known for his blunt speech and his skepticism about the witch trials. When his servant Mary Warren, one of the afflicted girls, started having fits, John Proctor said she was faking and threatened to beat her. This public dismissal of the afflictions made John Proctor a target. On April 11th, Elizabeth Proctor and John Proctor were examined. The afflicted girls immediately fell into fits when the Proctors entered the room. They screamed that the Proctor's specters were attacking them. John Proctor tried to defend himself and his wife, but every word he spoke was interpreted as evidence of guilt. His skepticism about the trials was now proof that he was a witch trying to protect himself and other witches. Elizabeth Proctor was pregnant, which would delay her execution under Puritan law. But John Proctor had no such protection. He would be held in prison to await trial, and his skepticism about witchcraft would not save him. The accusations continued. Bridget Bishop was accused in April. She was about 60 years old, a tavern keeper in Salem town, with a reputation for wearing red clothing and running a rowdy establishment where young people gathered to play games and drink. She had been accused of witchcraft once before, years earlier, and though nothing came of that accusation, it was now remembered and used against her. Bridget Bishop's examination was dramatic. The afflicted girls testified that they saw her specter tormenting them, but more than spectral evidence was used against Bridget Bishop. Several men testified that they had experienced strange encounters with her. One man said that years ago, Bridget Bishop had appeared in his bedroom at night and had lain on his chest, preventing him from moving or speaking, a classic description of what was then called a nightmare. Another man testified that Bishop had stolen eggs from him using witchcraft, making the eggs pass through solid walls invisibly. Most damning was testimony about Bridget Bishop's body. When she was examined for witch marks, the women who searched her found what they described as a preternatural teat in her private areas. This was interpreted as a witch's teat, an unnatural growth used to suckle familiar spirits. In reality, it was probably a normal anatomical variation, but in the context of a witchcraft examination, it became evidence of diabolical evil. Bridget Bishop was sent to prison. She would be the first to hang when executions finally began in June. Giles Corey, husband of the accused witch Martha Corey, was arrested in April. Giles Corey was about 80 years old, a prosperous farmer with a reputation for being stubborn and difficult. He had initially supported the witch trials and had even testified against his own wife. But as the accusations spread and he saw respected community members being arrested, Giles Corey began to doubt the proceedings. When he was accused himself, Giles Corey made a decision that would lead to one of the most horrific episodes of the Salem Witch Trials. He refused to enter a plea. Under English common law, which governed Massachusetts, a person could not be tried unless they entered a plea of guilty or not guilty. If someone refused to plead, they could be subjected to pressing, a brutal form of torture designed to force them to enter a plea so the trial could proceed. Giles Corey knew that if he were tried and convicted, his property would be confiscated by the government, leaving his family destitute. But if he died without being convicted, his property would pass to his heirs. So, he remained silent, accepting the consequences. We will return to Giles Corey's fate later in this narrative. For now, we note only that his arrest in April was another sign that the witch hunt had spiraled out of control. As April turned into May, the accusations reached higher social strata. Wealthy merchants from Salem town were accused. Ship captains were accused. Even ministers were accused. The most shocking accusation came when Reverend George Burroughs, the former minister of Salem Village, was named as a witch. George Burroughs had served as Salem Village's minister from 1680 to 1683. Leaving after disputes over his salary, he had moved to Maine, where he continued his ministry. Now, in 1692, the afflicted girls claimed that his specter appeared to them, and that he was not just a witch, but the ringleader of all the witches in New England, a kind of black minister who presided over diabolical Sabbaths where witches gathered to worship Satan. The accusation against a minister was extraordinary. Ministers were supposed to be God's representatives on earth, specially chosen and called to preach the gospel. The idea that a minister could be a witch seemed almost impossible, but the afflicted girls insisted it was true, and the magistrates believed them. George Burroughs was arrested in Maine and brought back to Salem in chains. His examination was one of the most dramatic of all the proceedings. The afflicted girls testified that they had seen him perform feats of supernatural strength, lifting barrels and guns that no normal man could lift. This strength, they said, came from the devil. When George Burroughs recited prayers and demonstrated his knowledge of Scripture, the afflicted girls said his specter was tormenting them even as he spoke holy words. They said he was a deceiver, using religion to hide his true nature as a witch. The fact that he could speak religious words was twisted into evidence of his diabolical cunning rather than proof of his innocence. George Burroughs was sent to prison. His case would become one of the most controversial of the Salem Witch Trials, and his execution would be the moment when many observers began to seriously question whether the trials were just. By May 1692, the prisons were overflowing with accused witches. The conditions were terrible. Prisoners were kept in chains in dark, cold, filthy cells. They were given minimal food and water. Many became sick. Some died before they could be tried. Sarah Osborne, one of the original 3 accused, died in prison on May 10th. She never stood trial. Her death was barely noted in the records, just another casualty of the witch hunt. The accusations continued to spread geographically. The town of Andover, about 10 miles from Salem, became a new center of accusations. The afflicted girls were brought to Andover to identify witches there, and they obliged, naming dozens of people. By the time the trials ended, Andover would have more accused witches than Salem itself. What explains this spread of accusations? How did a small group of afflicted girls in Salem Village end up naming people in towns they had never visited? Part of the answer is that the afflicted girls were encouraged by the authorities to continue making accusations. The magistrates and ministers believed they were fighting a vast conspiracy of witches, and they needed the afflicted girls to identify as many witches as possible. The girls were brought to prisons to identify whether accused witches were tormenting them. They were brought to other towns to identify witches there. They were constantly questioned about who they saw in their visions. The girls may have been motivated by the attention and power their accusations brought them. In a society where children and young women had no voice and no authority, the afflicted girls suddenly found that adults listened to everything they said. Magistrates and ministers sought their opinions. Entire examinations hinged on their testimony. They had the power to send people to prison or to the gallows with a word. Some of the afflicted girls may have genuinely believed they were seeing specters, in a culture that absolutely believed in the reality of the invisible world, that taught children from birth that the devil and his demons were constantly trying to steal souls. It is possible to have genuine delusions and hallucinations. If you believe witches are real, and you have been taught what their attacks look like, you might interpret ambiguous sensations or emotions as evidence of witchcraft. Other accusers may have been motivated by more mundane concerns. Some accusations clearly followed lines of existing disputes. People accused neighbors they had quarreled with over property boundaries or unpaid debts. Servants accused masters who had mistreated them. Children accused adults who had disciplined them. The Putnam family was particularly active in making accusations. Anne Putnam Jr. was one of the primary afflicted girls, and her father, Thomas Putnam, and mother Anne Putnam Sr. were deeply involved in the trials. The Putnams were one of the most prominent families in Salem Village, and they had been involved in numerous property disputes and political conflicts over the years. Many of the people accused had some connection to these disputes. Thomas Putnam wrote out many of the formal complaints that led to arrests. He testified frequently at examinations. His daughter Anne accused more people than any other afflicted person. When we map the web of accusations, the Putnam family sits at the center, and many of the accused were people who had crossed the Putnams in some way. This suggests that the Salem witch trials were not just about genuine religious fear or mass delusion. They were also about settling old scores, about using the witch hunt as a weapon to destroy enemies and rivals. But we must be careful not to oversimplify. The trials were complex, with multiple motivations at work simultaneously. Some accusers truly believed in witchcraft. Some were settling scores. Some were caught up in mass hysteria. Some were performing for attention. And once the trials gained momentum, it became difficult for anyone to stop them without being accused themselves of sympathizing with witches. By late May 1692, over 100 people had been accused of witchcraft. The prisons could barely hold them all, and still the accusations continued. The governor of Massachusetts, William Phips, who had been away in England, returned to find his colony in chaos. Something had to be done. The accused could not remain in prison indefinitely. Governor Phips created a special court to try the witchcraft cases. The Court of Oyer and Terminer, meaning to hear and determine, was established on May 27, 1692. The judges appointed to this court were all wealthy and powerful men. William Stoughton, the lieutenant governor, served as chief judge. The other judges included Samuel Sewall, John Hathorne, Jonathan Corwin, and several other prominent figures. These men were not lawyers or legal scholars. They were magistrates and merchants, politically powerful but not necessarily legally sophisticated. They would make decisions about life and death based on their understanding of English law, Puritan theology, and the evidence presented to them. The most important decision the Court of Oyer and Terminer would make was about the admissibility of spectral evidence. Should the court accept testimony from the afflicted about invisible specters that only they could see, or should the court require more tangible evidence of witchcraft? This question was debated among the ministers and magistrates of Massachusetts. Some ministers, including Cotton Mather, warned that spectral evidence alone should not be sufficient for conviction because the devil might be able to assume the shape of an innocent person to cause mischief. If the devil could make someone's specter appear to the afflicted even without that person's consent, then spectral evidence was unreliable. But other authorities argued that God would not allow the devil to impersonate innocent people, that seeing someone's specter was reliable evidence of that person's guilt. And practically speaking, if spectral evidence were not admitted, it would be almost impossible to convict anyone of witchcraft, since witchcraft by definition involved invisible, supernatural acts that left no physical evidence. The Court of Oyer and Terminer decided to accept spectral evidence. This decision sealed the fate of the accused. With spectral evidence admitted, the testimony of the afflicted girls became the primary basis for conviction, and there was no defense against it. The first session of the Court of Oyer and Terminer convened on June 2, 1692, in Salem town. The judges took their seats. The accused were brought from prison in chains. The afflicted girls were present to testify, and the trials that would result in 19 hangings and 1 pressing death were about to begin. The witch hunt had spread from 3 accused women to more than 100 in just 3 months. Now, the legal machinery of execution would begin to operate, and the people of Salem would discover that it is much easier to start a witch hunt than to stop one. The Court of Oyer and Terminer convenes. The Court of Oyer and Terminer was established on May 27, 1692, by Governor William Phips. The name comes from Anglo-Norman French, meaning to hear and to determine. This was a special commission granted to specific judges to hear and decide particular cases. In this instance, the court was created specifically to try the backlog of witchcraft cases that had accumulated in the prisons of Massachusetts. Governor Phips appointed 7 judges to the court. The chief judge was William Stoughton, the lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. Stoughton was a Harvard-educated minister who had never been ordained but had instead pursued a career in politics. He was rigid in his beliefs, certain of his righteousness, and he would prove to be the driving force behind the convictions and executions that followed. The other judges included John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, who had conducted the preliminary examinations of the accused. Also appointed were Samuel Sewall, a wealthy merchant and diarist whose later writings would provide valuable insights into the trials. Waite Still Winthrop, another prominent merchant. Bartholomew Gedney, a physician and magistrate from Salem. Peter Sargent, a wealthy Boston merchant. And Nathaniel Saltonstall, who would resign from the court after the first execution, apparently disturbed by the proceedings. These men were not trained lawyers. Colonial Massachusetts did not have a professional legal system in the modern sense. These were magistrates, men of wealth and political power, who administered justice as part of their civic duties. They would interpret English common law, Massachusetts colonial law, and their own understanding of biblical principles to decide questions of life and death. The court appointed Thomas Newton as the prosecutor. Stephen Sewall, brother of Judge Samuel Sewall, was appointed clerk of the court. No defense attorneys were provided for the accused. Under English law at the time, people accused of felonies were not entitled to legal representation. They had to defend themselves, standing alone before the judges and answering questions as best they could. This created an inherently unequal situation. The accused were usually uneducated farmers or servants, people with no understanding of legal procedure or rhetoric. They faced educated judges who were convinced of their guilt before the trial even began. The judges asked leading questions designed to trap the accused into incriminating statements, and the primary evidence against the accused came from the testimony of the afflicted, who would fall into fits and convulsions at strategic moments during the proceedings, making it nearly impossible for the accused to present a coherent defense. The court's first session was scheduled for June 2nd, 1692, in Salem town. The courthouse was packed with spectators. The people of Massachusetts had been living in fear for months, hearing stories of specters and diabolical rituals, watching as more and more of their neighbors were arrested. Now they would finally see justice done against the witches who had been tormenting their community. Before the trials could begin, the court had to make several crucial decisions about procedure and evidence. The most important question was whether to admit spectral evidence, the testimony of the afflicted about invisible specters that only they could see. This issue had been debated extensively among the ministers of Massachusetts. Cotton Mather, one of the most prominent Puritan ministers in the colony, had written a letter to the judges expressing his concerns about spectral evidence. Mather argued that the devil might be able to assume the shape of an innocent person to cause harm, and therefore, seeing someone's specter should not automatically be proof of that person's guilt. However, Mather also stated that the judges should vigorously prosecute witchcraft and that he supported the trials overall. His caution about spectral evidence was nuanced and hedged with qualifications. The judges could interpret his letter as supporting their use of spectral evidence if they wished, and that is exactly what they did. Other ministers were more straightforward in supporting the admission of spectral evidence. They argued that God would not allow the devil to impersonate innocent people, that such deception would undermine God's justice and order. If someone's specter was seen committing harmful acts, that person must have given the devil permission to use their shape, which meant they were guilty of witchcraft. The court decided to accept spectral evidence. This decision was fatal for the accused. Without spectral evidence, the prosecution would have difficulty proving witchcraft, since witchcraft by definition involved invisible supernatural acts. But with spectral evidence admitted, the word of the afflicted became sufficient grounds for conviction. The court also decided to search the accused for physical evidence of witchcraft. This meant examining their bodies for witch marks, unusual growths or blemishes that were believed to be teats used to suckle familiar spirits. Teams of women were appointed to conduct these intimate examinations, searching the bodies of the accused for any unusual marks. In an era before modern medicine, when people did not understand that birthmarks, moles, warts, scars, and other common skin conditions were natural, any unusual mark could be interpreted as evidence of witchcraft. The searches were humiliating and invasive, but they provided what seemed like physical evidence to supplement the spectral evidence. Another crucial decision involved confessions. The court had to determine how to treat people who confessed to witchcraft. The logic of the trials suggested that confessed witches should be executed, since they had admitted to the crime. But the court took a different approach. Those who confessed were often spared, at least temporarily, because they could provide information about other witches. Those who maintained their innocence were more likely to be executed, because their refusal to confess was seen as evidence that they were hardened in their evil and unrepentant. This created a perverse incentive. Confess to a crime you did not commit and live, or maintain your innocence and die. Many of the accused faced this impossible choice. Some chose to confess and name others as witches, hoping to save their own lives. Others refused to confess to a lie, even knowing that their honesty would lead to their deaths. As June arrived, the courthouse in Salem town prepared for the first trials. The jail cells were opened and the accused were brought forth. The afflicted girls were gathered to testify. The judges took their seats, and the machinery of legal execution began to operate. The court would sit in multiple sessions throughout the summer of 1692. By the time it concluded its work in September, the Court of Oyer and Terminer would hear dozens of cases. It would condemn 29 people to death. 19 would be hanged, 1 would be pressed to death under heavy stones, and several others would die in prison while awaiting trial, but all of that was still to come. On June 2nd, 1692, as the first trial began, the people of Salem believed they were finally striking back against the forces of evil that had infiltrated their community. They believed justice was being done. They did not yet understand that the real evil was not the imaginary conspiracy of witches, but the very trials intended to root them out. Spectral evidence, seeing invisible demons. The concept of spectral evidence was central to the Salem Witch Trials. To understand how 19 people could be executed based primarily on testimony about invisible spirits, we must understand what the Puritans believed about the nature of witchcraft and the invisible world. In Puritan theology, reality consisted of two realms: the physical world that everyone could see and touch, and the spiritual world that existed alongside it. The spiritual world was populated by God and his angels, but also by Satan and his demons. These spiritual beings could affect the physical world and could interact with human souls. A witch was someone who had made a covenant with the devil, signing their soul over to Satan in exchange for supernatural powers. Once this pact was made, the witch could perform maleficium, harmful magic directed at their neighbors. They could curse crops, sicken livestock, cause diseases, and inflict pain and suffering on other people. One of the powers that witches supposedly possessed was the ability to send out their specter, a kind of spiritual projection of themselves that could travel invisibly and interact with the physical world. The witch's body might remain at home, apparently engage in innocent activities, while their specter traveled miles away to torment victims. The specter could do everything the physical witch could do. It could pinch, bite, choke, and strike. It could speak and make threats. It could appear in visible form to the victim, looking exactly like the witch, even wearing the same clothes the witch was wearing at that moment. But the specter was invisible to everyone except the victim and other people with special sight, such as other afflicted individuals or those with heightened spiritual sensitivity. This belief in specters created an impossible defense situation. If an accused witch said, "I was at home at the time of the alleged attack, and witnesses can confirm I never left my house," the response was, "Your body was at home, but your specter was tormenting the victim." There was no way to disprove this accusation. You could not provide an alibi for your specter. The only evidence of spectral attacks came from the victims themselves. They would testify that they saw the specter of the accused witch. They would describe what the specter did and said, and their testimony was treated as eyewitness evidence, as reliable as if they had seen a physical assault take place. At the Salem Witch Trials, spectral evidence took several forms. The afflicted would testify that they saw the specter of the accused in their visions. They would describe the specter's actions in detail. They would report conversations they claimed to have with the specter. They would identify the specter's clothing, which matched what the accused was wearing at that moment in the courtroom. Most dramatically, the afflicted would demonstrate the specter's attacks during the trials themselves. When an accused witch moved their hand, the afflicted would cry out that the specter's hand was pinching them. When the accused shifted position, the afflicted would react as if struck. This synchronized suffering seemed to provide real-time proof of the specter's existence and malevolence. The judges and spectators could not see the specters, but they could see the afflicted girls' reactions. They saw real pain, real terror, real physical distress. The girls' fits were not gentle or ambiguous. They screamed, they convulsed, they contorted their bodies. They showed marks on their skin where they claimed the specter had bitten or pinched them. To the observers, this suffering was real and undeniable. Modern historians and psychologists have offered various explanations for the afflicted girls' behavior. Some suggest they were suffering from genuine psychological conditions, such as conversion disorder, where psychological distress manifests as physical symptoms. Others propose they were experiencing mass hysteria or sociogenic illness, where psychological symptoms spread through a group by social means. Some historians argue that the girls were consciously lying, that they fabricated their afflictions for attention or to harm people they disliked. Others suggest that the girls may have started with genuine psychological distress that was then interpreted as witchcraft by the adults around them, and they then performed the role expected of them, unable to escape the narrative they had inadvertently created. Still other historians point to possible physical causes. Ergot, poisoning from contaminated grain, can cause convulsions, hallucinations, and other symptoms similar to those displayed by the afflicted. Encephalitis or other neurological conditions might explain some cases. Deliberate use of hallucinogenic plants, either as medicine or recreation, might explain others. The truth is that we cannot know with certainty what caused the afflictions. The historical record does not provide enough medical detail to make a definitive diagnosis across 4 centuries. What we can say is that the Puritan interpretation of these symptoms as evidence of witchcraft led directly to the trials and executions that followed. The theological problem with spectral evidence was recognized even at the time. Some ministers, including Cotton Mather, worried that if the devil could assume the shape of an innocent person without that person's consent, then spectral evidence was unreliable. The devil might frame innocent people by appearing in their form. This concern was not theoretical. It had practical implications for how the trials should be conducted. If spectral evidence could not be trusted, then the court would need other forms of evidence to convict accused witches: confessions, testimony about physical acts of witchcraft, physical evidence like witch marks or poppets used to curse victims, or the testimony of multiple independent witnesses about suspicious behavior. But William Stoughton, the chief judge, rejected these concerns. He argued that God would not allow the devil such power to deceive. If someone's specter was seen committing harmful acts, that person must be guilty. To suggest otherwise was to question God's justice and providence. Stoughton's position became the operating principle of the Court of Oyer and Terminer. Spectral evidence was admitted and given significant weight. The testimony of the afflicted about what they saw in the invisible world became the primary basis for conviction. This reliance on spectral evidence had several consequences. First, it made convictions easy to obtain. The prosecution merely had to present the afflicted, who would testify about seeing the accused's specter and demonstrate their suffering. The accused had no way to refute this testimony, since they could not prove what their specter had or had not done. Second, it meant that anyone could be accused and convicted. Social status, church membership, and reputation provided no protection. If the afflicted said they saw your specter, you were guilty, regardless of your character or your protestations of innocence. Third, it created an incentive structure that encouraged false accusations. The afflicted received attention, sympathy, and power when they made accusations. They were never punished for being wrong or for accusing innocent people. In fact, their accusations were treated as heroic acts, exposing witches who threatened the community. Fourth, spectral evidence made the trials unfalsifiable. Any contrary evidence could be explained away. If witnesses testified that the accused was elsewhere when the attack supposedly occurred, the response was that the specter, not the body, had committed the act. If the accused led a pious life and seemed unlikely to be a witch, the response was that this was deception, a disguise to hide their true nature. The very absence of evidence for witchcraft became evidence of how cunning the witch was. The ministers of Massachusetts tried to have it both ways. They wanted the witch trials to proceed vigorously, but they also wanted to express caution about spectral evidence to protect themselves from future criticism. The result was ambiguous guidance that the judges interpreted as support for their aggressive use of spectral evidence. On June 15, 1692, a group of ministers, including Cotton Mather, issued a document called The Return of Several Ministers Consulted. This document advised the judges to be cautious about spectral evidence and to seek additional evidence beyond the testimony of the afflicted. However, the document also congratulated the judges on their vigorous prosecution of witchcraft and encouraged them to continue their work. The judges focused on the encouragement and largely ignored the caution. They continued to admit spectral evidence and to base convictions primarily on the testimony of the afflicted. The ministers' warnings were too little, too late, and too ambiguous to change the course of the trials. As the trials progressed through June and into July, the pattern became clear. The accused would be brought before the court. The afflicted would testify about seeing their specter and being tormented by it. The afflicted would fall into fits during the proceedings, crying out in pain when the accused moved or spoke. Sometimes additional evidence would be presented: testimony about suspicious behavior, evidence of witch marks, reports of threats or curses supposedly made by the accused. But the core of nearly every conviction was spectral evidence. Those who confessed were asked to name other witches, and their confessions were used as evidence against those they named. Those who maintained their innocence were convicted based on the spectral evidence against them and sentenced to death. The executions were scheduled to begin in June. The gallows were prepared on a rocky hillside outside Salem town that would become known as Gallows Hill, and the first person to hang would be Bridget Bishop, the tavern keeper who had been one of the earliest accused and whose reputation made her an easy target for the community's fear and rage. The machinery of legal execution was operating efficiently now. Accusations led to arrests. Arrests led to examinations. Examinations led to trials. Trials led to convictions. And convictions led to the gallows. 20 people would die before the witch hunt finally ended. And spectral evidence, the testimony about invisible spirits that only the afflicted could see, would be the rope that hanged them. June 10th, 1692, Bridget Bishop hangs. First, Bridget Bishop was the first person executed in the Salem Witch Trials. Her trial took place on June 2nd, 1692, in the newly convened Court of Oyer and Terminer. Her execution followed 8 days later, on June 10th. Between these two dates, the Salem witch hunt crossed a threshold from imprisonment to killing, from accusation to execution. Bridget Bishop was about 60 years old in 1692. She had been married 3 times, twice widowed, and once divorced, which was unusual enough to make her notable in a community where most marriages lasted until death. She owned and operated a tavern in Salem town, an establishment where young people gathered to drink and play shuffleboard and socialize in ways that the more austere members of the Puritan community found inappropriate. Bishop dressed in bright colors, particularly red, at a time when Puritan culture favored black and gray and considered bright clothing to be vain and worldly. She was known for speaking her mind and not deferring to men who expected deference. She had a sharp tongue and a quick temper. In short, Bridget Bishop was exactly the kind of woman the Puritan community found threatening: independent, outspoken, and unapologetic. She had been accused of witchcraft once before, years earlier, though those charges had been dropped. But the memory of that earlier accusation lingered, and when the witch hunt began in 1692, Bridget Bishop was an obvious target. The afflicted girls testified that they had seen Bridget Bishop's specter tormenting them. They described being pinched, bitten, and choked by her invisible presence. They fell into fits during her examination, screaming and writhing whenever she looked at them or moved. But the case against Bridget Bishop included more than just spectral evidence. Several people testified about strange encounters with her that seemed to demonstrate supernatural powers. One man, Samuel Gray, testified that 14 years earlier, when he had been sick in bed, Bridget Bishop had appeared in his room at night. She had approached his bed and stood over him. He had tried to move or cry out, but found himself paralyzed, unable to move or speak. After a time, Bishop had vanished, and he had regained the ability to move. This experience, he said, had caused him great fear and distress. Another man, William Stacy, testified that he had hired Bridget Bishop to help with some work. After a disagreement over payment, Bishop had left his property muttering angrily. Later that day, Stacy's daughter had been seized with violent fits. A wagon wheel on Stacy's property had mysteriously broken, and Stacy himself had experienced strange nighttime visitations, where he felt a presence in his room that he could not see clearly, but which filled him with terror. Samuel Shattuck testified that years ago, his son had been healthy until Bridget Bishop had interacted with the child. After Bishop touched or spoke to the boy, Shattuck claimed the child had been seized with fits and had seemed to be wasting away despite having a good appetite. The child's illness, Shattuck believed, was caused by Bishop's curse. John Bly testified that he had been hired to help move some of Bishop's property. In the process, he and his son had found several cloth dolls hidden in the walls of Bishop's former house. These dolls, or poppets, were stuck full of pins. In folk magic traditions, such poppets were used to curse victims. You would make a doll representing your victim, then stick pins in it to cause the victim pain. The discovery of these poppets seemed to be physical evidence of Bishop's witchcraft. Perhaps most damning was the testimony about Bridget Bishop's body. When a team of women examined her for witch marks, they reported finding a preternatural teat between her privates and her anus, described as a piece of flesh about an inch long. This was interpreted as a witch's teat used to suckle familiar spirits. Modern historians note that what the examiners likely found was a hemorrhoid or some other normal anatomical variation. But in 1692, with the court already convinced of Bishop's guilt, this physical finding seemed to confirm all the spectral evidence and testimony about her malicious acts. Bridget Bishop defended herself as best she could. She denied being a witch. She denied hurting the children or anyone else. She said she knew nothing about the poppets found in her house. She said she had never seen the devil or made any pact with him, but her denials were ineffective. The judges believed the witnesses who testified against her. They believed the afflicted girls who said they saw her specter. They believed the physical evidence of the witch mark on her body. And they interpreted her vigorous self-defense as evidence of an unrepentant witch who refused to confess her crimes. The trial was brief. By the standards of the time, the evidence seemed overwhelming. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict. Guilty of witchcraft. Chief Judge William Stoughton pronounced the sentence. Bridget Bishop was to be hanged by the neck until dead. The execution was scheduled for June 10th, giving Bishop 8 days to consider her sins and perhaps confess before meeting her fate. There is no record of Bridget Bishop confessing during those 8 days. She maintained her innocence to the end. On the morning of June 10th, she was taken from her prison cell and transported to Gallows Hill, a rocky outcropping on the western edge of Salem town. A large crowd gathered to witness the execution. Public executions were common in the colonial era, seen as a form of moral instruction for the community. The death of a criminal was supposed to serve as a warning to others, and as a demonstration of the community's commitment to justice and godly order. Bridget Bishop was led up the hill to the gallows. The method of execution was hanging, which in the 17th century was crude and often slow. There was no trapdoor mechanism to ensure a quick death by broken neck. Instead, the condemned person was made to stand on a ladder or a cart. The noose was placed around their neck, and then the ladder was kicked away, or the cart pulled out from under them. Death came from strangulation, not from a broken neck, and could take several minutes of conscious suffering. As was customary, Bridget Bishop was given an opportunity to speak before the execution. She again declared her innocence. She said she was no witch and had committed no crime. She forgave those who had falsely accused her and condemned her. And then the noose was placed around her neck. The executioner carried out the sentence. Bridget Bishop hung from the gallows, struggling for breath, until she finally died. Her body was cut down and buried in a shallow grave near the execution site, in unconsecrated ground, as was typical for executed criminals. The crowd dispersed. The ministers who had attended the execution preached sermons about the righteousness of the court's judgment and the importance of continuing to root out witchcraft from the community. The afflicted girls, who had attended the execution, reported that they felt relief now that Bishop could no longer torment them with her specter. But Bridget Bishop's execution had an unexpected effect. One of the judges, Nathaniel Saltonstall, was troubled by what he had witnessed. Unlike his fellow judges, Saltonstall had serious doubts about the trial's fairness and the reliability of the evidence. After Bishop's execution, Saltonstall resigned from the Court of Oyer and Terminer. He was replaced by Jonathan Corwin, but Saltonstall's resignation was noted and remembered as one of the few acts of dissent by someone in authority during the trials. The execution also prompted some of the ministers to reconsider their support for the trials. A group of ministers met in mid-June and issued the document, The Return of Several Ministers Consulted, which cautioned the judges about relying too heavily on spectral evidence. However, as we have seen, this caution was accompanied by encouragement to continue prosecuting witches, and the judges interpreted the overall message as support for their proceedings. For the accused still languishing in prison, Bridget Bishop's execution was a terrifying development. The trials were no longer theoretical. The court was not just examining and imprisoning accused witches, it was killing them. Anyone who had been arrested and charged now knew that they might share Bishop's fate. The executions had begun, and they would not stop until September. Bridget Bishop was the first, but 18 more would follow. The gallows on the hill outside Salem town would become a place of horror where neighbors watched neighbors die, where families saw their loved ones executed, where the community's fear and rage found its expression in judicial murder. June 10th, 1692, marked a point of no return for the Salem Witch Trials. Before that date, it was still possible to imagine that the trials might end without bloodshed, that the accused might eventually be released or pardoned. After that date, the momentum toward more executions became almost unstoppable. The judges had committed themselves to the belief that they were fighting a real conspiracy of witches. To stop now would be to admit they had been wrong. To admit they had been wrong would mean admitting that Bridget Bishop had been innocent, that they had murdered an innocent woman. That admission was psychologically impossible for most of the judges and ministers involved. So, the trials continued, more people were tried, more verdicts of guilty were returned, and more executions were scheduled. The next hanging would take place on July 19th, and this time, it would not be just one person, but 5 women executed on the same day in a mass hanging that would shock even those who supported the trials. Bridget Bishop died proclaiming her innocence. History has vindicated her. In 1711, the Massachusetts colonial legislature passed a resolution exonerating Bishop and others executed in the witch trials, and her heirs were paid compensation for the injustice done to her. In 1957, the state of Massachusetts formally apologized for the witch trials, and in 1992, on the 300th anniversary of the trials, A memorial was erected in Salem to honor the victims, including Bridget Bishop's name. But these acts of remembrance and apology came too late for Bridget Bishop. She hung on Gallows Hill on June 10, 1692, the first victim of a witch hunt that would claim 19 more lives before reason finally prevailed over fear. July 19th, 5 women executed on Gallows Hill. After Bridget Bishop's execution on June 10th, the Court of Oyer and Terminer paused its proceedings. The judges had heard concerns from some ministers about the use of spectral evidence. They wanted to ensure they were proceeding correctly before continuing with more trials and executions. But the pause was brief. By late June, the court resumed its sessions. More trials were held throughout late June and early July. And on July 19, 1692, Salem witnessed its most horrific day yet. 5 women were hanged together in a mass execution. The 5 women executed on July 19th were Sarah Good, Rebecca Nurse, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. Each had been tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. Each maintained their innocence to the end, and each represents a different aspect of how the witch hunt consumed the community. Sarah Good was one of the original 3 women accused back in March. She was a homeless beggar, pregnant at the time of her arrest, despised by her neighbors for her poverty and her sharp tongue. She had given birth to her baby in prison, and the infant had died shortly after birth in those terrible conditions. Sarah Good had spent 4 months in chains, awaiting trial, watching other accused witches be brought in, and knowing that execution was coming. At her trial, the evidence against her was primarily spectral. The afflicted girls testified that they saw her specter tormenting them. Her own husband testified against her, saying he feared she was a witch. Her past threats and mutterings were brought up as evidence that she cursed her neighbors. Sarah Good's defense was simple. She was innocent. She had made no pact with the devil. She had harmed no one. Her poverty and her difficult personality did not make her a witch, but the court did not believe her. The jury found her guilty, and she was sentenced to hang. Rebecca Nurse was 71 years old, deaf, frail, and widely regarded as one of the most pious women in Salem. Her arrest had shocked the community. How could such a godly woman be a witch? 39 people had signed a petition testifying to her good character. Her family fought desperately to save her. At Rebecca Nurse's trial, the spectral evidence against her was strong. The afflicted girls testified that her specter had tormented them repeatedly. Ann Putnam Jr. claimed that Nurse's specter had appeared to her and boasted about killing several people through witchcraft over the years. But there was also testimony in Nurse's favor. Many witnesses spoke about her piety, her kindness, her devotion to her family and church. The evidence seemed evenly balanced between accusation and defense. The jury initially returned a verdict of not guilty. The courtroom erupted. The afflicted girls immediately fell into fits, screaming and convulsing. The judges expressed their dissatisfaction with the verdict. Chief Judge William Stoughton pointed out an ambiguous statement Nurse had made during the trial and suggested the jury reconsider. The jury deliberated again. This time, they returned a verdict of guilty. Rebecca Nurse's family was devastated. They appealed to Governor Phipps, who initially granted a reprieve, postponing the execution. But the afflicted girls continued to have fits, and public pressure mounted. The reprieve was withdrawn. Rebecca Nurse was sentenced to hang. On the eve of her execution, the church in Salem Village formally excommunicated Rebecca Nurse, declaring that she was cut off from the Christian community and damned to hell. This spiritual death preceded her physical death, adding a final cruelty to her suffering. Susanna Martin was a widow from Amesbury, about 15 miles from Salem. She was in her 70s, known for her sharp wit and her refusal to be intimidated by the accusations against her. At her examination back in May, she had laughed at the absurdity of the charges. When the afflicted girls fell into fits, claiming her specter was attacking them, Martin had stood calmly and asked how she could possibly be afflicting them when she was standing still in front of the magistrates. Her confidence and her laughter were interpreted as evidence of her guilt. A witch would laugh at the suffering of her victims. An innocent person would be distraught and fearful. Martin's composure was used against her. At her trial, multiple witnesses testified about suspicious events from years past. One man claimed that years ago, after an argument with Martin, his oxen had behaved strangely and he had felt an evil presence. Another claimed that Martin had appeared to him in spectral form and attempted to press him down into his bed. A third testified that Martin had threatened him, and afterward his cattle had died mysteriously. These testimonies reached back years, even decades. The trial became an opportunity to dredge up every misfortune and unexplained event and attribute them to Susanna Martin's witchcraft. She defended herself with wit and sarcasm, but her defense only made her seem more guilty in the eyes of the judges. She was convicted and sentenced to hang. Elizabeth Howe was a farmer's wife from Ipswich in her 50s, blind in one eye. She was known as a kind and pious woman, but she had been involved in a property dispute years earlier, and old resentments surfaced during the witch hunt. She was accused by several people who claimed her specter had appeared to them. At her trial, Howe defended herself earnestly. She said she had never hurt anyone, never made a pact with the devil, never practiced witchcraft in any form. She spoke of her faith in God and her hope for salvation, but the spectral evidence against her was deemed sufficient for conviction. The jury found her guilty, and she was sentenced to hang. Sarah Wilds was from Topsfield, a town near Salem. She was in her 60s, known for being argumentative and difficult. She had been involved in various disputes with neighbors over the years, and when the witch hunt spread to Topsfield, old enemies saw an opportunity to accuse her. Multiple witnesses testified that after arguing with Sarah Wilds, they had experienced misfortunes. One woman claimed that after a dispute, her nursing infant had suddenly taken ill and died. Another said that Wilds had cursed her husband, and the husband had subsequently been injured. A man testified that he had seen Wilds in the company of other suspected witches late at night, behaving suspiciously. Wilds maintained her innocence, but the accumulation of testimony against her was overwhelming in the eyes of the court. She was convicted and sentenced to hang. On the morning of July 19th, these 5 women were taken from their prison cells. They were loaded into a cart and transported through the streets of Salem town to Gallows Hill. The route took them past their former homes, past the meeting house where they had worshipped, past the faces of neighbors who had once been friends but were now spectators to their destruction. The crowd that gathered at Gallows Hill was large. Some came out of genuine belief that they were witnessing justice done against servants of Satan. Others came out of morbid curiosity. Still others came to support the condemned, believing them to be innocent. The 5 women were taken from the cart and led to the gallows. The nooses were prepared. The ministers present offered final prayers and exhortations, urging the condemned to confess their sins before meeting their Maker. Sarah Good was defiant to the end. When Reverend Nicholas Noyes urged her to confess, calling her a witch, Good replied, "You are a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." This curse became famous in Salem. Years later, when Noyes died of a hemorrhage that caused him to choke on his own blood, many remembered Sarah Good's words and saw them as a witch's curse fulfilled, though others saw it as divine judgment on a minister who had sent innocent people to their deaths. Rebecca Nurse prayed quietly, commending her soul to God. She spoke words of forgiveness for those who had condemned her, though she maintained to the end that she was innocent of witchcraft. Susanna Martin faced death with courage. She said she died innocent and that God knew her innocence. She forgave her accusers and expressed hope that her death might be the last, though she must have known more executions were planned. Elizabeth Howe and Sarah Wilds also proclaimed their innocence and prayed for mercy, both from God and from the community that was about to kill them. Then the executions proceeded. The 5 women were hanged one after another, or possibly simultaneously. The historical record is not entirely clear on the exact procedure. They died by strangulation, a slow and agonizing process that could take several minutes. The crowd watched in silence or with prayers or with satisfaction, depending on their beliefs about the justice of the proceedings. After the women were dead, their bodies were cut down. Unlike executed criminals in England, who were often left hanging as a warning, the bodies in Salem were buried quickly. They were buried in shallow graves near the gallows, in unconsecrated ground. The families of the executed were not allowed to give them proper Christian burials. However, tradition holds that under cover of night, family members came to retrieve some of the bodies and gave them secret burials on family property with prayers and dignity. Rebecca Nurse's family is said to have taken her body and buried it in an unmarked grave on the family homestead. Years later, when the witch trials had been repudiated, a proper gravestone was erected for her. The mass execution of July 19th was a turning point in the Salem Witch Trials, though not in the way one might hope. Instead of shocking the community into reconsidering the trials, the executions seemed to validate them. 5 witches had been executed. Surely the afflictions would stop now. Surely the community was safer. But the afflictions did not stop. The afflicted girls continued to have visions and fits. More people were accused. The witch hunt was not ending. It was intensifying. The month of August would bring more trials and more convictions. And on August 19th, 6 more people would be executed, including a former minister who would die proclaiming his innocence even after perfectly reciting the Lord's Prayer, something witches supposedly could not do. The gallows on the hill outside Salem town were becoming a symbol of the community's descent into madness. 5 women had died there in July. 6 more would die in August. And in September, 8 more would hang in the final mass execution before the trials finally ended. But we are not there yet. The worst is still to come. You are 90 minutes into the Salem Witch Trials. You have witnessed Bridget Bishop become the first to hang. You have seen 5 women executed in a single day on July 19th. You have heard Sarah Good curse Reverend Noyes from the gallows, telling him that God will give him blood to drink. You have witnessed Rebecca Nurse, the pious 71-year-old grandmother, hang despite a petition signed by 39 people testifying to her good character. The worst is still coming. In August, Reverend George Burroughs will recite the Lord's Prayer perfectly before his execution, something witches supposedly could not do. He will be hanged anyway. Giles Corey will refuse to enter a plea and will be crushed under stones, taking 2 days to die. And in September, 8 more people will hang in the final mass execution. If you are captivated by history's darkest moments, subscribe to The Deep Unknown. We create 3-hour history documentaries perfect for sleep, study, or losing yourself in the past. New videos every week. The witch hunt is not over. Stay with us as we witness how far fear and superstition can drive a community toward destruction. August 19th, Reverend George Burroughs hanged. August 19th, 1692, saw another mass execution in Salem. 6 people were hanged that day. Reverend George Burroughs, John Proctor, George Jacobs Sr., John Willard, and Martha Carrier. But the execution of George Burroughs stands out as perhaps the most controversial and troubling of all the Salem executions. George Burroughs had served as the minister of Salem Village from 1680 to 1683. His tenure had been contentious. The village had difficulty paying his salary, and after his wife died, leaving him with several children to care for, Burroughs had struggled financially. When he left Salem Village, there were still disputes over unpaid wages and debts. He had moved to Maine, where he continued his work as a minister in the frontier town of Wells. When the witch hunt began in 1692, the afflicted girls claimed that George Burroughs' specter appeared to them. Ann Putnam Jr. testified that Burroughs' specter had told her he had bewitched his first 2 wives to death, and several soldiers who had died in Indian attacks. This was an astonishing accusation. The afflicted were claiming that a minister was not just a witch, but a murderer who used witchcraft to kill. More than that, the afflicted claimed that George Burroughs was the ringleader of all the witches in New England. They said he presided over witches' Sabbaths, where witches gathered to worship Satan and plan their attacks on the Christian community. He was portrayed as a kind of anti-minister, a diabolical parody of a Christian pastor who led his congregation in evil rather than good. Burroughs was arrested in Maine in May and brought back to Salem in chains. His examination took place on May 9th and was one of the most dramatic of all the proceedings. The afflicted girls fell into violent fits when he was brought into the room. They claimed his specter was tormenting them, even as he stood before the magistrates. The evidence presented against Burroughs was a mixture of spectral testimony and more tangible accusations. The afflicted testified extensively about his specter appearing to them and forcing them to sign the devil's book. They claimed he had told them about murders he had committed through witchcraft. But there was also testimony about Burroughs' physical strength. Several witnesses testified that they had seen Burroughs perform feats of strength that seemed superhuman. He had supposedly lifted heavy barrels full of cider with one hand. He had carried large guns through the forest with ease, guns that should have required 2 men to carry. This strength, the witnesses claimed, could only come from the devil. When questioned about these feats, Burroughs did not deny them. He explained that he was naturally strong and that the incidents had been exaggerated in the retelling. But his admission that he had lifted heavy objects was taken as confirmation that he had supernatural strength granted by his master, Satan. Other witnesses testified about Burroughs' religious practices. Some claimed he had not properly administered communion when he was minister in Salem Village. Others said he did not have his children baptized. These failures to observe proper religious rituals were seen as evidence that Burroughs was not truly a Christian minister, but an impostor serving the devil. The most damaging testimony came from his own family. His former father-in-law testified about disputes within Burroughs' household. Servants who had worked for Burroughs testified about his temper and his allegedly tyrannical treatment of his wives. This testimony portrayed Burroughs as a bad husband and master, which fit the narrative that he was secretly evil. Burroughs defended himself eloquently. He denied all charges of witchcraft. He explained his financial struggles in Salem Village and his difficult relationships with some parishioners, but he insisted these were normal human conflicts, not evidence of diabolical conspiracy. He spoke of his faith in God and his years of faithful ministry, but the court was not persuaded. The spectral evidence was overwhelming in quantity, if not in quality. The testimony about his strength suggested demonic power. The conflicts in his past were reinterpreted as evidence of his evil nature. George Burroughs was convicted of witchcraft and sentenced to hang. The execution on August 19th brought an enormous crowd to Gallows Hill. The idea of executing a minister was shocking. Ministers were supposed to be God's representatives, specially called and anointed for their work. If a minister could be a witch, then anyone could be a witch. The execution of Burroughs would either validate the entire witch hunt or raise profound questions about whether the court was making terrible mistakes. 6 people were hanged that day, but all attention focused on George Burroughs. As was customary, he was given an opportunity to speak before his execution, and what he did next sent shockwaves through the crowd. George Burroughs recited the Lord's Prayer. He recited it perfectly, without stumbling, without error, from beginning to end. This was significant because of a widespread belief that witches could not recite the Lord's Prayer correctly. The prayer was considered so holy, so powerful, that servants of Satan would be unable to speak it without stumbling or making mistakes. The idea was that a witch's tongue would rebel against speaking such sacred words, or that the devil would prevent them from saying the prayer correctly. But George Burroughs, accused of being the chief witch in New England, recited the prayer perfectly. He then delivered a moving speech proclaiming his innocence and his faith in God. He prayed for his accusers and for the community. He asked God to forgive those who had condemned him unjustly. The crowd was deeply moved. Many people began to weep. Some shouted out that Burroughs should be spared. The mood shifted dramatically. It seemed that perhaps a terrible mistake was being made. Cotton Mather, the prominent minister who was present at the execution, saw the danger. If the crowd turned against the execution, if they began to believe Burroughs was innocent, the entire witch hunt might collapse. All the previous trials and executions would be called into question. Mather addressed the crowd from horseback. He reminded them that the court had found Burroughs guilty based on substantial evidence. He pointed out that the devil was a deceiver and could give his servants the ability to recite prayers if that would serve his purposes. He argued that Burroughs was so deep in Satan's service that he could mimic piety convincingly. Mather urged the crowd to trust the judges and to allow justice to proceed. The crowd's moment of rebellion passed. Whether Mather's words persuaded them, or whether they simply lacked the collective courage to physically intervene, the execution continued. George Burroughs was hanged. He died proclaiming his innocence. His body was cut down and buried in a shallow grave. The other 5 people executed that day received less attention, but each had their own tragedy. John Proctor was the skeptical tavern owner who had publicly dismissed the afflicted girls as frauds. His outspoken opposition to the trials had made him a target. And his wife Elizabeth was also convicted, but spared execution because she was pregnant. George Jacobs Sr. was about 80 years old, frail, and using 2 canes to walk. He had been accused by his own granddaughter, who was one of the afflicted. At his examination, Jacobs had angrily denounced the proceedings as fraudulent, calling the afflicted girls liars. This defiance had sealed his fate. His granddaughter later recanted her testimony, admitting she had lied, but the recantation came too late to save Jacobs. John Willard had initially served as a constable, helping to arrest accused witches. But as the arrests continued and Willard saw respected community members being taken to prison, he began to doubt the proceedings. He expressed his doubts publicly and refused to arrest any more people. Immediately, he himself was accused of witchcraft. He fled, but was captured and brought back for trial. His skepticism about the trials was interpreted as evidence that he was a witch trying to protect himself and his fellow conspirators. Martha Carrier was from Andover, where the witch hunt had spread in the summer of 1692. She was a woman with a fierce temper and a sharp tongue, known for not backing down from conflicts with neighbors. Her children had been arrested and tortured into confessing witchcraft and testifying against their mother. Cotton Mather called her the Queen of Hell, based on testimony that she was a leader among the witches. She maintained her innocence to the end and was hanged along with the others. The execution of August 19th marked another step in the escalation of the witch hunt. A minister had been executed. An 80-year-old man had been hanged. A woman had been convicted based in part on testimony extracted from her tortured children. The trials were consuming the community, spreading geographically, reaching higher into the social structure, and showing no signs of stopping. But the execution of George Burroughs began to plant seeds of doubt even among some supporters of the trials. If a minister who could recite the Lord's Prayer perfectly could be hanged as a witch, what did that say about the reliability of the evidence and the judgment of the court? Cotton Mather had explained away the problem, arguing that the devil could give his servants the ability to seem pious. But this explanation was troubling. If witches could convincingly fake piety, how could anyone ever be certain who was truly godly and who was secretly serving Satan? The witch hunt was reaching its peak in August 1692. One more execution was scheduled for September, another mass hanging that would claim 8 more lives, but forces were already in motion that would eventually bring the trials to an end. Some ministers were quietly expressing concerns about the proceedings. Some of the accused were people of such high social status that their arrests raised questions about whether the accusations had gotten out of control, and some of the afflicted were beginning to make accusations that seemed incredible even to people who believed in witchcraft, naming prominent officials and merchants, and even suggesting that the governor's own wife might be a witch. The machinery of the witch hunt was still operating in August, but the gears were beginning to grind. The contradictions and absurdities were becoming too obvious to ignore. And in the coming weeks, the trials would finally come to an end, not because of a sudden revelation of truth, but because the accusers overreached and the authorities realized that if the trials continued, no one would be safe. September 19, Giles Corey pressed to death. Between the August 19th executions and the final mass hanging planned for late September, one of the most horrific episodes of the Salem Witch Trials took place. Giles Corey, an 80-year-old farmer, was pressed to death on September 19th, 1692. Giles Corey's story is one of the most tragic and heroic of the entire witch hunt. Corey was a prosperous farmer in Salem Village, known for being cantankerous and litigious. He had been involved in various disputes and lawsuits over the years. When his wife Martha Corey was accused of witchcraft in March 1692, Giles had initially supported the prosecution, even testifying about strange events in his household that might indicate his wife was a witch. But as the trials progressed and more people were arrested, Giles Corey began to doubt the proceedings. He saw neighbors and friends arrested on flimsy evidence. He watched as the accusation spread to people of high social standing, whose guilt seemed unlikely. And he began to speak critically about the trials. In April, Giles Corey himself was accused of witchcraft. The accusation came from multiple afflicted individuals who claimed they saw his specter tormenting them. Testimony was presented about Corey's past. He had been involved in violent incidents years earlier, including an incident where a servant in his household had died under suspicious circumstances. These old stories were dredged up and reinterpreted as evidence of diabolical evil. Corey was arrested and examined, but he made a decision that would set him apart from nearly all the other accused witches. When brought before the court for his trial, Giles Corey refused to enter a plea. He would not say guilty, and he would not say not guilty. He simply remained silent. Under English common law, a person could not be tried unless they entered a plea. A trial required the defendant to formally respond to the charges. If someone refused to plead, the court could not proceed with the trial. Why would Giles Corey refuse to plead? The historical record does not give us his explicit reasoning, but we can infer his motivations from the consequences of his choice. If Corey were tried and convicted of witchcraft, his property would be confiscated by the colonial government. This was standard practice for those convicted of capital crimes. His wife was already convicted and awaiting execution. If he were also convicted, their children and grandchildren would inherit nothing. The family would be left destitute, but if Corey died without being convicted, his property would pass to his heirs according to his will. The law was clear on this point. Only conviction resulted in confiscation. Death without trial did not. Giles Corey knew that refusing to plead would result in his death. The punishment for refusing to plead was peine forte et dure, a French term meaning hard and forceful punishment. In English legal practice, this meant pressing. The defendant would be laid on the ground, and heavy stones would be placed on their chest until they either agreed to plead or died. Corey chose to protect his family's property at the cost of his own life. He chose a death by torture rather than submit to a trial he knew would be unjust. On September 19, 1692, Giles Corey was taken to a field outside the Salem jail for his pressing. He was stripped naked and laid on the ground. A wooden board was placed on his chest. Then stones were added one by one, increasing the weight on his body. The process of pressing was intended to be gradual, giving the victim multiple opportunities to agree to plead. Between additions of stones, the authorities would ask Corey if he was ready to enter a plea. Each time, he refused. The weight on his chest increased. His ribs began to crack under the pressure. Breathing became difficult, then agonizing. Blood vessels in his eyes burst from the strain. His tongue was forced out of his mouth by the pressure. According to some accounts, when Corey's tongue protruded, Sheriff George Corwin used his cane to push it back into Corey's mouth, adding to the torment. The detail may be apocryphal, but it illustrates the brutality of the procedure and the callousness of those administering it. The pressing continued for 2 days. Giles Corey lay in the field with stones piled on his chest, unable to move, barely able to breathe, in excruciating pain. Periodically, the authorities would ask if he was ready to plead. Each time, he either remained silent or, according to legend, said only, "more weight." More weight has become the famous last words attributed to Giles Corey, though whether he actually said this or whether it is a later embellishment is uncertain. The phrase captures the essence of his defiance. He would not submit. He would not give the court the satisfaction of a plea. He would die on his own terms. On September 19th, after 2 days of torture, Giles Corey died. He was 80 years old. He had endured unimaginable suffering, rather than participate in a legal process he viewed as corrupt and unjust. Corey's death was shocking even to many who supported the witch trials. Pressing was a rare punishment, seldom used even in England. To apply it to an 80-year-old man seemed excessive, and Corey's refusal to submit, his willingness to die in agony rather than plead, suggested a strength of conviction that troubled observers. Would a guilty witch have the courage to endure such torture? Or did Corey's defiance indicate his innocence? But these doubts did not stop the trials. Corey's death was noted, and the trials continued. 3 days after Corey's pressing, on September 22nd, 8 more people would be hanged in the final mass execution of the Salem witch hunt. Giles Corey achieved his goal. His property passed to his heirs. His sons-in-law were named in his will, and they inherited his considerable landholdings. The colonial government could not confiscate property from a man who had never been convicted, but the cost was terrible. Corey died in agony, crushed under stones, a martyr to his own principles and to his family's financial security. In later years, Giles Corey became a folk hero in Salem. His defiant more weight became a symbol of resistance to unjust authority. Stories spread that Corey had cursed the office of the sheriff of Essex County before his death, and that subsequent sheriffs died or suffered misfortune, supposedly fulfilling the curse. Like Sarah Good's curse on Reverend Noyes, this story probably says more about the community's guilt and need for supernatural explanations than about any actual curse. In the 19th century, the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote about Giles Corey in his play, Giles Corey of the Salem Farms, portraying him as a tragic hero. In the 20th century, Arthur Miller included Corey in his play, The Crucible, depicting his pressing as one of the most powerful moments in that dramatization of the witch trials. Giles Corey was formally exonerated in 1712 when the Massachusetts colonial legislature passed a bill reversing the convictions of those executed in the witch trials. But this legal vindication came too late for Corey and the others, who died in 1692. September 19, 1692, stands as one of the darkest days in American legal history. An 80-year-old man was tortured to death by officers of the law for refusing to participate in judicial proceedings. The fact that this happened not in some medieval dungeon, but in late 17th century Massachusetts, in a community that prided itself on its Christian values and its rule of law, makes it all the more shocking. Giles Corey's pressing was the penultimate death in the Salem Witch Trials. 3 days later, 8 more people would hang, and then finally, the killing would stop. But before we reach that ending, we must witness the final executions and understand what finally brought the trials to a close. September 22nd, the final 8 executions. September 22nd, 1692, was the last execution day of the Salem Witch Trials. 8 people were hanged on Gallows Hill that day. Martha Corey, Mary Easty, Alice Parker, Mary Parker, Ann Pudiator, Margaret Scott, Wilmot Redd, and Samuel Wardwell. With these deaths, the total number executed reached 19, plus Giles Corey, who had been pressed to death 3 days earlier. Martha Corey was the widow of Giles Corey, who had just died under the stones. She was one of the first respectable church members to be accused back in March when the witch hunt was still in its early stages. Her arrest had shocked the community because she was known for her piety and regular church attendance. Her husband had initially testified against her, though he later regretted it and became skeptical of the trials, leading to his own arrest and eventual pressing death. Martha Corey had maintained her innocence throughout the months of imprisonment and trial. At her examination in March, she had made the mistake of seeming to mock the proceedings, suggesting that the afflicted girls were lying or deluded. This skepticism was used against her as evidence that she was a witch trying to discredit her victims. The spectral evidence against Martha Corey was substantial. Multiple afflicted individuals testified that they saw her specter tormenting them. They claimed she appeared to them in visions and tried to force them to sign the devil's book. During her examination, the afflicted girls had demonstrated the now familiar pattern of synchronized suffering. When Martha bit her lip, they screamed that her specter was biting them. When she clasped her hands, they cried out that their hands were being forced together by invisible power. Martha Corey had been excommunicated from the church before her execution, formally cast out of the Christian community. Now, 3 days after watching her husband crushed to death, she was led to the gallows. She prayed for her executioners and for the community. She forgave those who had condemned her. And then she was hanged, dying alongside 7 others in the final mass execution. Mary Easty was the sister of Rebecca Nurse, who had been hanged on July 19th, and Sarah Cloyce, who was in prison awaiting trial. Mary Easty was about 58 years old, known as a kind and gentle woman, devoted to her family and her faith. Her arrest had been particularly troubling to many in the community because she seemed so clearly innocent. In fact, Mary Easty had been arrested, examined, and then released in May when the afflicted girls said they were no longer tormented by her specter. She had gone home, reunited with her family, and tried to resume her life. But within days, the afflicted girls claimed that Easty's specter had returned and was tormenting them worse than before. She was arrested again, and this time there would be no release. Mary Easty had written a petition to the judges before her execution, one of the most eloquent and moving documents from the witch trials. In it, she did not plead for her own life. She knew she was going to die. Instead, she pleaded for the court to reconsider its methods so that no more innocent people would be executed after her. She wrote that she was innocent of witchcraft, but that she was willing to die if that was God's will. However, she begged the judges to examine their procedures more carefully, to seek additional evidence beyond spectral testimony, to question whether the afflicted might be mistaken or even lying. She asked the judges to consult with ministers from other colonies who might have different perspectives on how to try witchcraft cases. Her petition was ignored. Mary Easty was hanged on September 22nd, proclaiming her innocence and praying for those who condemned her. Her dignity and grace in the face of death made a profound impression on many witnesses. Alice Parker and Mary Parker were both from Salem, but were not related despite sharing a last name. Both were accused primarily on spectral evidence, with the afflicted testifying that they saw the women's specters tormenting them. Both maintained their innocence. Both were convicted and sentenced to hang. Alice Parker was known for being outspoken and argumentative. She had been involved in disputes with neighbors over the years, and old grudges came to the surface during the witch hunt. Witnesses testified about mysterious illnesses and misfortunes that had befallen them after arguments with Parker, attributing these events to her witchcraft. Mary Parker was a widow in her 50s. She had the misfortune of having a difficult relationship with her grown children, and testimony from family members about arguments and tensions in the household was used against her. When she was examined, she defended herself vigorously, but her protests were interpreted as evidence of an unrepentant witch. Anne Pudeator was a widow in her 70s from Salem town. She had been married multiple times, and there were rumors about her involvement in the deaths of her husbands, rumors that resurfaced during the witch trials as accusations of murder through witchcraft. She was also known for her healing skills, making herbal remedies and nursing the sick, activities that could be interpreted as benevolent or malevolent depending on one's perspective. Several people testified that after receiving medicine or treatment from Anne Pudeator, they had become worse rather than better. This was taken as evidence that she was a witch using her position as a healer to harm people. The fact that some patients recovered after her treatments was ignored. Only the failures were remembered and attributed to malice. Anne Pudeator protested her innocence and pointed out the inconsistencies in the testimony against her. But the court was not interested in inconsistencies. She was convicted and sentenced to hang. Margaret Scott was in her 70s, from Rowley, a town north of Salem. She was a widow living in poverty, dependent on charity from her neighbors. Like Sarah Good before her, Margaret Scott's poverty and her need to beg made her unpopular and vulnerable to accusation. Witnesses testified that Scott had threatened them when they refused her requests for charity, and that misfortunes had followed these threats. One man claimed that after denying Scott food, his cattle had died mysteriously. Another said that Scott had cursed him, and he had subsequently fallen ill. These testimonies, based on events that had occurred years earlier, were sufficient for conviction. Wilmot Red was from Marblehead, a fishing town on the coast. She was in her 60s, known for having a sharp tongue and for not suffering fools gladly. She had a reputation as someone who spoke curses when angered, and these curses were now interpreted as witchcraft. Multiple witnesses testified about arguments with Red, followed by misfortunes. One woman claimed that after a dispute with Red, she had been struck with temporary blindness. A man testified that Red had cursed his fishing boat and that he had subsequently lost his catch and suffered financial hardship. The accumulation of these testimonies, spanning many years, was used to portray Red as a longtime practitioner of witchcraft. Samuel Wardwell was unusual among those executed because he was a man, and because he had initially confessed to witchcraft before later recanting. Wardwell was from Andover, where the witch hunt had spread in the summer of 1692. He was about 50 years old, known for his skill at fortune-telling and palm reading, activities that were considered sinful and potentially diabolical by Puritan standards. When first arrested and examined, Wardwell had confessed to signing the devil's book and practicing witchcraft. He had provided details about meetings with the devil and with other witches. His confession had seemed to validate the accusations and was used as evidence against other accused witches from Andover. But Wardwell later recanted his confession. He said he had lied because he was frightened and confused, because the interrogators had pressured him, because he thought confessing would save his life. He insisted that he had never been a witch, that his fortune-telling had been harmless entertainment, and that his confession had been false. The court did not accept his recantation. A confession once given could not be withdrawn without calling into question all the other confessions that had been extracted. If Wardwell could falsely confess, then perhaps others had as well, and the entire edifice of the trials might collapse. So, Wardwell's recantation was ignored, and he was convicted based on his original confession. He was sentenced to hang. On the morning of September 22nd, these 8 people were taken to Gallows Hill. The crowd that gathered was large, but more somber than at previous executions. The trials had been going on for months now. 20 people had been condemned to die. Dozens more languished in prison, and still the afflictions continued. The executions had not stopped the torments. The community was no safer than it had been in March. Some observers were beginning to question whether the trials were just. The execution of Rebecca Nurse had troubled many people. The pressing death of Giles Corey had shocked the community. The execution of Reverend George Burroughs, who had recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, had raised doubts about the reliability of the evidence. And now, 8 more people were about to die, including Mary Easty, whose petition had eloquently pleaded for reconsideration of the court's methods. The 8 condemned were given their opportunity to speak. Each proclaimed their innocence. Each prayed for mercy and forgiveness. Some wept. Some maintained composure. Samuel Wardwell reportedly stumbled in his final prayer, and this stumbling was immediately seized upon by observers as evidence of his guilt, proof that even at the moment of death, the devil interfered with his ability to pray properly. This interpretation ignored the obvious fact that a man about to be hanged might stumble over words out of fear and distress rather than diabolical influence. Then the executions proceeded. The 8 were hanged, their bodies convulsing at the end of the ropes until death finally came. The crowd dispersed. The bodies were cut down and buried in shallow graves. September 22nd, 1692, marked the end of the executions, though no one knew it at the time. More trials were scheduled. More accused witches waited in prison. The afflicted girls continued to have visions, but no more executions would take place. Why did the executions stop? The answer is complex, involving multiple factors that came together in October 1692 to finally end the witch hunt. First, the accusations were reaching too high into the social structure. When the afflicted began accusing the wives of wealthy merchants and prominent officials, including suggesting that the governor's own wife might be a witch, the authorities realized that the trials had spun out of control. If the governor's wife could be accused, then no one was safe. The trials threatened to tear apart the entire colonial government. Second, public opinion was shifting. The execution of people like Rebecca Nurse, Mary Easty, and Reverend George Burroughs had troubled many colonists. These were manifestly good people, pillars of their communities, whose deaths seemed unjust. The fact that the executions had not stopped, the affliction suggested that perhaps the wrong people were being executed. Third, some of the afflicted were beginning to recant. Mary Warren had briefly admitted that the afflictions were fake before being terrorized back into her role as an accuser. But other afflicted individuals were starting to express doubts. Some of the confessors who had named others as witches were beginning to recant, saying they had lied under pressure. Fourth, ministers from outside Massachusetts were expressing concerns about the trials. The use of spectral evidence was controversial, and ministers from New York and Connecticut suggested that Massachusetts was proceeding incorrectly. Fifth, the prisons were overflowing with accused witches, and the costs of maintaining them were becoming unsustainable. Prisoners had to pay for their own food and lodging while in prison, and many families were bankrupted by these costs. The system was breaking down under its own weight. All these factors would come together in October to finally end the Salem Witch Trials. But that ending would not bring immediate relief to those in prison, and it would not restore the lives of those who had been executed. The damage had been done. Salem would have to reckon with what it had done, and that reckoning would take years. October 1692. The governor ends the trials. October 1692 was the turning point when the Salem Witch Trials finally began to end. The executions had stopped after September 22nd, but the trials themselves continued. More people were examined, more were arrested, and the prisons remained full of accused witches awaiting their fate. But forces were in motion that would ultimately bring the witch hunt to a close. The most important of these forces was Governor William Phips, who had established the Court of Oyez and Terminer in May, but had then left Massachusetts to lead military campaigns in Maine against French and Native American forces. When Phips returned in late September, he found the colony in chaos. More than 200 people had been accused of witchcraft. 20 had been executed. Dozens more had been convicted and were awaiting execution. The prisons were overflowing. Families were being bankrupted by the costs of keeping their relatives imprisoned, and the accusations showed no signs of stopping. More troubling to Phips were reports that prominent people were now being accused. Several wealthy merchants had been named as witches. Ministers were under suspicion. And most alarmingly, Phipps's own wife, Lady Mary Phips, had been cried out upon by the afflicted. The accusation against Lady Phipps had not resulted in arrest, probably because even the magistrates recognized that arresting the governor's wife would be politically disastrous. But the fact that she had been accused demonstrated that the witch hunt had become uncontrollable. Phipps began to investigate what had happened during his absence. He consulted with ministers and magistrates. He reviewed trial records. And he began to have serious doubts about the proceedings. The primary issue was spectral evidence. The court of Oyer and Terminer had relied heavily on the testimony of the afflicted about invisible specters that only they could see. But this evidence was problematic. If the devil could assume the shape of innocent people, then spectral evidence was unreliable. And practically speaking, how could anyone defend themselves against accusations about what their invisible specter had done? Phipps also heard about the execution of Rebecca Nurse, the pious grandmother whose conviction had troubled many people. He heard about Reverend George Burroughs reciting the Lord's Prayer before his execution. He heard about Giles Corey being pressed to death. These stories suggested that the trials were executing innocent people, not just catching genuine witches. In early October, Increase Mather, one of the most prominent ministers in Massachusetts and the father of Cotton Mather, delivered a sermon in Boston that questioned the use of spectral evidence. The sermon was titled Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits, and it argued that spectral evidence alone should not be sufficient for conviction in witchcraft cases. Increase Mather's position was more cautious than his son, Cotton Mather's, had been. Where Cotton Mather had supported the trials with only mild cautions about spectral evidence, Increase Mather was more forthright in his criticism. He argued that it was better for 10 guilty witches to escape than for one innocent person to be condemned. This was a direct challenge to the methods the court of Oyer and Terminer had been using. The sermon was endorsed by 14 other ministers, making it a significant statement of clerical opinion. While the ministers still affirmed their belief in witchcraft and their support for prosecuting witches, they made clear that the standards of evidence needed to be higher than what had been used in the Salem trials. Governor Phipps took action. On October 29, 1692, he dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer. The special court that had been created in May to try witchcraft cases was disbanded. All pending cases were suspended. No more trials would be held under the procedures that had led to the 19 executions. This was an extraordinary step. Phipps was essentially admitting that the court he had created had been operating incorrectly. He was stopping the trials in mid-process, leaving dozens of accused witches in legal limbo, neither convicted nor acquitted. Phipps's decision was driven partly by principle and partly by pragmatism. He may have genuinely come to believe that the trials were unjust, but he was also responding to political pressure. The accusations against prominent people threatened the stability of the colonial government. The cost of the trials was becoming unsustainable, and public opinion was turning against the proceedings. The afflicted girls continued to have fits and visions even after the court was dissolved. They continued to name new witches, but now their accusations were ignored. Without the court to give official sanction to their testimony, the girls' visions were just visions, disturbing but not legally actionable. The question now was what to do with the people already in prison. More than 100 accused witches were held in jails in Salem, Boston, Ipswich, and other towns. Some had been convicted and were under sentence of death. Others had been examined and were awaiting trial. Still others had merely been accused and were waiting for examination. Phipps decided to establish a new court, the Superior Court of Judicature, to handle the remaining cases. This court would operate under different rules than the court of Oyer and Terminer. Most importantly, spectral evidence would not be admitted. Convictions would require tangible evidence of witchcraft. Confessions, witness testimony about physical acts, evidence of witch marks or poppets, or other material proof. The Superior Court of Judicature convened in January 1693. It heard numerous witchcraft cases carried over from the previous year, but under the new rules, conviction became nearly impossible. Without spectral evidence, the prosecution had little to work with. Most cases resulted in acquittal. A few people were convicted, primarily those who had confessed. But even these convictions were problematic, because many of the confessions had clearly been extracted under duress. Phipps issued reprieves for those convicted, effectively pardoning them. By May 1693, all the accused witches had been released from prison. Some were acquitted by the court, Others were released by proclamation of the governor. The Salem Witch Trials were over. But the end of the trials did not mean the end of suffering. People who had been imprisoned for months emerged physically and psychologically damaged. Many had lost everything while in prison. Their farms had gone to ruin without anyone to tend them. Their businesses had collapsed. They had sold possessions to pay prison fees and to support themselves during their incarceration. Some families had been destroyed by the trials. Rebecca Nurse and Mary Easty were sisters, both executed. Their sister Sarah Cloyce had been imprisoned for months before being released. The three sisters' families were devastated financially and emotionally. The Proctor family had seen John Proctor executed, while his wife Elizabeth was convicted but spared because of her pregnancy. Their property had been confiscated after John's conviction. Elizabeth eventually gave birth in prison and was released in 1693, but she had to fight for years to recover any of their property. Some of those accused never recovered their reputations. Even after being released from prison, they were viewed with suspicion by some neighbors. The stigma of having been accused of witchcraft lingered. The financial costs were staggering. The colonial government had spent enormous sums on the trials, paying magistrates, maintaining prisons, transporting prisoners, paying for examinations and trials. Individual families had been bankrupted by prison fees and legal costs. The psychological and social costs were incalculable. The witch hunt had torn communities apart. Families were divided. Neighbors who had lived peacefully together for decades now viewed each other with suspicion and resentment. The bonds of trust that held society together had been shattered, and 20 people were dead. 19 hanged, 1 pressed to death, and several others who died in prison during the months of incarceration. These deaths could not be undone. The families of the executed carried their grief and rage for years. The end of the trials in October 1692 was not a triumphant moment of truth overcoming error. It was an exhausted collapse of a system that had spun out of control. The authorities did not suddenly realize they had been wrong. They simply recognized that the trials could not continue without destroying the colony itself. And crucially, no one in authority admitted error in October 1692. Governor Phipps suspended the trials, but he did not declare that the previous executions had been unjust. The ministers who questioned spectral evidence still maintained that witchcraft was real, and that some of those executed might have been genuine witches. The judges who had convicted and sentenced people to death did not apologize. This lack of acknowledgement made the aftermath of the witch trials even more painful. The executed were not exonerated. The imprisoned were not compensated. The accusers were not punished for false testimony. Everything was simply left in a state of ambiguity and unresolved guilt. It would take years for Massachusetts to begin to reckon with what had happened in Salem, and that reckoning, when it finally came, would be incomplete and unsatisfying. But at least the killing had stopped. At least no more people would die on Gallows Hill. The witch hunt was over, even if justice was still far away. The aftermath, guilt, apologies, compensation. The years following the Salem witch trials were marked by a slow, painful process of reckoning with what had happened. The trials had ended in October 1692, but the consequences rippled through Massachusetts society for decades. In the immediate aftermath, there was mostly silence. The authorities who had conducted the trials did not want to talk about them. The families of the executed were grieving and trying to rebuild their shattered lives. The accusers, the afflicted girls, and others who had testified mostly disappeared from the historical record, their later lives unrecorded or deliberately forgotten. But silence could not last forever. Too many people had been affected. Too many had died. Too many families had been destroyed. Eventually, some form of accountability would have to emerge. The first significant public acknowledgement of error came in 1697, 5 years after the trials. The Massachusetts colonial legislature declared January 14th as an official day of fasting and soul-searching, asking the people to reflect on the sins committed during the witch trials and to seek God's forgiveness. On that day, Samuel Sewall, one of the judges who had served on the court of Oyez and Terminer, stood up in church and publicly acknowledged his guilt. Sewall gave his minister a written statement, admitting that he had been wrong to convict and execute people based on spectral evidence. He asked for forgiveness from God and from his community. He took public shame upon himself for his role in the deaths of innocent people. Sewall's public confession was extraordinary. In Puritan culture, public acknowledgement of sin was an important religious practice, but for a judge to admit he had wrongly condemned people to death was unprecedented. Sewall's statement read, in part, "Samuel Sewall, sensible of the reiterated strokes of God upon himself and family, desires to take the blame and shame of it, asking pardon of men, and especially desiring prayers that God would pardon that sin. Sewall would carry his guilt for the rest of his life." In his diary, he frequently referenced the witch trials and his role in them, expressing ongoing remorse. Unlike the other judges who remained silent about their involvement, Sewall made his repentance public and lasting. But Sewall was the only judge to apologize. William Stoughton, the chief judge who had been the driving force behind the convictions, never expressed any regret. He remained convinced that the trials had been just, and that those executed had been genuine witches. Stoughton continued his political career, eventually becoming acting governor of Massachusetts, dying in 1701 without ever acknowledging error. John Hathorne, who had conducted many of the preliminary examinations with such aggressive certainty of the accused's guilt, also never apologized. He lived until 1717, respected and successful in his community, apparently untroubled by his role in the witch hunt. His great-great-grandson, the author Nathaniel Hawthorne, would later add a W to the family name and write extensively about the Salem Witch Trials, perhaps trying to atone for his ancestors' sins. In addition to the official day of fasting, there were private acknowledgments of error. Some of the afflicted girls eventually admitted they had lied or been mistaken in their accusations. Ann Putnam Jr., who had been one of the most active accusers, made a public confession in 1706, 14 years after the trials. She stood before the congregation of the Salem Village Church and had her confession read aloud. In it, she admitted that she had accused innocent people. However, her confession contained a significant qualification. She said she had been deluded by Satan, that the devil had deceived her into seeing specters and making false accusations. This framing of her confession was psychologically convenient. Ann Putnam did not have to take full responsibility for her actions. She could blame the devil for deceiving her, making herself another victim of the witch hunt rather than a perpetrator. The confession expressed sorrow for the deaths she had caused, but it did not fully accept personal accountability. Other afflicted girls never confessed at all. Most disappear from the historical record after the trials. We know little about what happened to Abigail Williams, Betty Paris, or most of the others. Whether they felt guilt, whether they maintained that they had truly seen specters, whether they simply tried to forget and move on with their lives, we do not know. The families of those executed sought restitution. They wanted their relatives' names cleared. They wanted the convictions reversed. And they wanted financial compensation for the property that had been confiscated and the costs they had incurred during the trials. In 1702, the Massachusetts General Court declared that the trials had been unlawful. This was an important step, acknowledging that legal errors had been made, but it did not go far enough for the families of the executed. In 1711, the colonial legislature finally passed a comprehensive bill that reversed the convictions of many of those executed or accused in the witch trials. The bill declared that the trials had been conducted incorrectly and that those convicted had been innocent. It also appropriated money to compensate the families of the victims. The total compensation was £600, a significant sum but hardly adequate for what the families had lost. The money was distributed according to a formula that attempted to account for property confiscated, prison fees paid, and the social standing of the deceased. The distribution was uneven, and many families felt it was insufficient. Moreover, not all victims were included in the 1711 bill. Some families were left out entirely, and it would take additional legislation over many years to fully exonerate all those who had been executed or imprisoned. The process of compensation revealed tensions about how to value different victims. Those who had been wealthy or prominent received larger compensation than those who had been poor. The families of accused witches who had been imprisoned but not executed received less than families of those executed, and those who had confessed to witchcraft, even under duress, were often excluded from compensation entirely. The ministers who had supported the trials also faced a reckoning, though a gentler one than the judges. Cotton Mather, who had been one of the most visible clerical supporters of the trials, never directly apologized. He wrote extensively about the trials in later years, defending his actions while also expressing some regret about how things had proceeded. His accounts emphasized that he had cautioned against relying solely on spectral evidence, downplaying the fact that he had also vigorously supported the prosecutions. Mather remained a controversial figure for the rest of his life. Some saw him as a man of learning and piety who had made an honest mistake. Others saw him as someone whose fear of witchcraft and desire for influence had contributed to a terrible injustice. His reputation never fully recovered from his association with the Salem trials. Increase Mather, Cotton's father, emerged with his reputation more intact because he had been more cautious in his support for the trials and had spoken out against spectral evidence earlier than his son. But even Increase Mather never fully acknowledged the horror of what had happened, or the role that ministerial support had played in enabling the trials. The community of Salem itself was transformed by the witch trials. Salem Village, where the accusations had begun, was permanently scarred. In 1752, Salem Village changed its name to Danvers, perhaps trying to distance itself from its dark history. The Nurse family homestead, where Rebecca Nurse had lived before her arrest and execution, became a site of memory preserved by her descendants. Relationships that had been destroyed by the trials were never fully repaired. Families that had accused each other remained estranged for generations. The Putnam family, which had been so central to the accusations, saw its influence decline in the years after the trials as their neighbors remembered their role in the witch hunt. Some individuals who had been involved in the trials tried to make amends in personal ways. John Proctor's son, who had watched his father be executed, eventually married and had a family. One of his daughters was named Elizabeth, probably after John Proctor's wife, who had been convicted but spared. The act of naming preserved memory and honored the family members who had been wronged. The church in Salem Village was divided by the trials. Reverend Samuel Parris, in whose house the afflictions had begun, was eventually forced to resign his position in 1697. His ministry had been irreparably damaged by the trials. His farewell sermon was defensive, arguing that he had done his best in difficult circumstances, but few in the congregation were willing to forgive him. The physical sites associated with the trials became places of memory and sometimes of avoidance. Gallows Hill, where the executions had taken place, was not marked or commemorated. The exact location of the gallows was eventually forgotten, lost to later generations. Only recently have historians and archaeologists worked to identify the precise site where the 19 were hanged. The graves of those executed were unmarked in unconsecrated ground, but some families had secretly retrieved the bodies and buried them on family property. These secret burials became family traditions, passed down through generations. Rebecca Nurse's grave on the Nurse homestead eventually received a marker, though not until long after her death. The psychological aftermath of the trials is difficult to quantify, but must have been profound. People who had accused their neighbors of witchcraft had to live with what they had done. People who had been accused and imprisoned had to cope with the trauma of their experience. Children who had watched parents or grandparents executed carried that trauma for life. Some of those involved in the trials left Massachusetts entirely, unable to bear living in a place that reminded them constantly of what had happened. Others stayed and tried to rebuild, but the shadow of 1692 hung over them always. The Salem Witch Trials became a cautionary tale, invoked whenever there was concern about injustice or mass hysteria. But the lessons were not always learned. Throughout American history, there would be other episodes of mass accusation, other witch hunts, metaphorical if not literal, other times when fear and suspicion overcame reason and justice. The aftermath of the Salem Witch Trials was a process of slow, incomplete healing. Some apologies were made, some compensation was paid, some names were cleared, but no amount of apology could bring back the dead. No amount of compensation could restore what had been lost. The families of the executed carried their grief and their anger forward into future generations, and Salem itself would forever be associated with one of the darkest chapters in American history. Why it happened, fear, religion, and power. Why did the Salem Witch Trials happen? How did a community of educated religious people convince themselves that their neighbors were servants of Satan who deserved to die? What combination of factors created the conditions for mass hysteria and judicial murder? There is no single answer to these questions. The Salem Witch Trials resulted from a complex interaction of religious belief, social tension, legal procedures, gender dynamics, economic factors, and individual psychology. Understanding the trials requires examining all these elements and how they reinforced each other to create a perfect storm of accusation and execution. The foundation of the witch trials was religious belief. The Puritans absolutely believed in the reality of the devil and in the existence of witches. This was not superstition or ignorance. It was orthodox Christian theology, accepted by educated ministers who had studied at Harvard and Cambridge. The Bible explicitly mentioned witches and commanded that they not be suffered to live. To doubt the existence of witches was to doubt the Bible itself. Moreover, the Puritans believed they were living in a cosmic war between God and Satan. Every aspect of life was part of this war. God wanted souls saved for heaven. The devil wanted souls damned to hell. Witches were the devil's soldiers in this war, actively working to destroy the godly community and drag people to damnation. This worldview made vigilance against witchcraft a religious duty. To ignore evidence of witchcraft was to allow Satan's soldiers to operate freely. To prosecute witches was to defend God's kingdom. The witch trials were not seen as persecution, but as necessary defense of the Christian community. The specific context of Massachusetts in the late 17th century intensified these religious concerns. The Puritans had come to New England believing they were creating a city on a hill, a model Christian society that would inspire the world. But by 1692, this vision seemed to be failing. The original settlers were dying, and the younger generation seemed less committed to Puritan principles. The colony's charter had been revoked and then partially restored, with changes that reduced the church's power. There were military threats from French forces and Native American tribes. Disease, harsh weather, and economic difficulty plagued the region. To the Puritan ministers and magistrates, these difficulties suggested that God was displeased with Massachusetts. The colony must be harboring sin, and God was punishing them until they rooted out the evil. When the witch accusations began, they seemed to explain everything. The troubles of the colony were caused by witches working for Satan to destroy the godly community. By prosecuting witches, the colony could restore God's favor. Social tensions also played a crucial role. Salem Village was divided into factions. Some families wanted independence from Salem town. Others wanted to maintain the connection. Property disputes simmered for years. Families competed for status and influence. These tensions created an environment where accusations could follow the fault lines of existing conflicts. Many of the accusations show patterns that suggest personal grievances rather than genuine belief in witchcraft. People accused those they had argued with over property boundaries. Servants accused masters who had mistreated them. People who had been embarrassed or humiliated by someone found an opportunity for revenge through witchcraft accusations. The Putnam family exemplifies this dynamic. Thomas Putnam and his wife Anne were deeply involved in the trials. Their daughter Anne Putnam Jr. was one of the most active accusers. Many of the people accused had some connection to disputes involving the Putnam family. Property disagreements, political conflicts, and personal grudges from years past surfaced during the witch hunt, transformed into accusations of diabolical conspiracy. Gender dynamics were central to the witch trials. The majority of those accused were women, and the majority of accusers were also women and girls. This pattern reflects the complex role of gender in Puritan society. Women in Puritan New England had limited power and authority. They could not vote, hold office, or speak in church. They were expected to be subordinate to men, first to their fathers and then to their husbands. Any woman who violated these expectations, who was too independent, too outspoken, too sexual, or too unconventional, was vulnerable to accusation. Many of the accused women were exactly these types. Widows who had inherited property and controlled their own affairs, women who ran businesses, women who spoke their minds, women who didn't fit the Puritan ideal of feminine submission. Accusation of witchcraft was a way to punish and control women who stepped outside their prescribed roles. But women were also the primary accusers. The afflicted girls gained power and attention through their accusations. In a society that normally silenced young women, the afflicted were suddenly the center of attention, with adults hanging on their every word. This role reversal must have been intoxicating, and it helps explain why the accusations continued, even when it became clear that terrible injustices were being committed. Economic factors also influenced the witch trials. Many of the accused were people whose property others coveted. When someone was convicted of witchcraft, their property was confiscated. This created an incentive for accusations. If you wanted someone's land or had a debt you didn't want to pay, accusing them of witchcraft could be advantageous. The Proctor family lost their tavern and considerable property when John Proctor was convicted. The property was confiscated and sold, benefiting those who acquired it. George Jacob Sr.'s conviction similarly resulted in property confiscation, enriching the colony at the expense of his heirs. While it would be too cynical to suggest that all accusations were economically motivated, economic considerations certainly influenced some accusations and shaped how the trials proceeded. The legal system itself contributed to the tragedy. The acceptance of spectral evidence meant that conviction was easy and defense was nearly impossible. The court of Oyer and Terminer operated under procedures that presumed guilt and made acquittal unlikely. The judges were not neutral arbiters but active prosecutors, asking leading questions designed to extract confessions. Moreover, the legal system created perverse incentives. Those who confessed were spared, at least temporarily, while those who maintained innocence were executed. This incentive structure encouraged false confessions and accusations of others. People confessed to save their own lives and then named others as accomplices, spreading the accusations further. The psychology of mass hysteria also played a role. Once the accusations began and were validated by authorities, they became self-reinforcing. Each accusation seemed to confirm the previous accusations. Each execution seemed to prove that witches were real and dangerous. People began to interpret ambiguous events as evidence of witchcraft. A cow dying, a child falling ill, a nightmare, an argument. All could be reinterpreted as diabolical attacks once you believed witches were active in your community. The afflicted girls may have experienced genuine psychological distress that was then interpreted through the lens of witchcraft belief. Or they may have been consciously performing, caught in a role they couldn't escape without admitting they had lied. Either way, their behavior convinced observers that witchcraft was real and active. The role of specific individuals cannot be ignored. William Stoughton's rigid certainty and aggressive prosecution drove many convictions. Cotton Mather's influence as a minister lent legitimacy to the trials. The Putnam family's active involvement in making accusations shaped which people were targeted. If different individuals had been in positions of authority, the trials might have proceeded differently or might not have happened at all. Finally, the trials happened because there was no effective opposition. A few people expressed doubts. Nathaniel Saltonstall resigned from the court. Some ministers cautioned about spectral evidence. Some people signed petitions defending accused individuals. But these voices were minority opinions, drowned out by the majority who believed in the reality of the witch conspiracy. Those who might have opposed the trials more vigorously were afraid to do so. Speaking out against the trials could itself lead to accusation of witchcraft. Defending an accused witch might suggest you were sympathetic to witchcraft, or even a witch yourself. The climate of fear silenced potential dissenters. The Salem Witch Trials were not an isolated aberration, but a product of their time and place. They happened because a community believed absolutely in witchcraft, because social tensions needed an outlet, because the legal system was structured to produce convictions, because gender dynamics made women vulnerable, because economic incentives shaped accusations, and because mass psychology created a self-reinforcing cycle of fear and accusation. Understanding why the Salem Witch Trials happened does not excuse them. 20 innocent people died. Hundreds more were imprisoned and traumatized. Families were destroyed. A community was scarred for generations. These facts remain true regardless of the explanations we offer. But understanding the causes of the witch trials serves an important purpose. It reminds us that ordinary people, given certain beliefs and certain circumstances, are capable of terrible injustices. It warns us to be skeptical of mass accusations, to demand high standards of evidence, to protect the rights of the accused, and to resist the temptation to see our neighbors as enemies in a cosmic war. The people of Salem believed they were fighting evil. They believed they were protecting their community. They believed they were doing God's work. They were wrong, and their tragic mistake teaches us that good intentions and sincere beliefs are not sufficient to ensure justice. We need legal protections. We need skepticism of extraordinary claims. We need courage to dissent from the majority, and we need humility about the limits of our certainty. The Salem Witch Trials happened because specific people made specific choices in a specific historical context. They need not have happened. At multiple points, different choices could have stopped the trials or limited their scope. But those choices were not made, and 20 people died, and Salem became synonymous with injustice and hysteria. The question is not just why it happened then, but whether it could happen again. The answer, unfortunately, is yes. Throughout history, societies have experienced witch hunts, moral panics, and mass accusations. The specific beliefs may change. We no longer believe in literal witchcraft, but the underlying dynamics remain. Fear, social tension, scapegoating, legal procedures that favor accusers, and the psychology of mass hysteria can combine to create injustice in any era. The Salem Witch Trials stand as a warning from history. This is what we are capable of when fear overcomes reason, when certainty overcomes doubt, and when the desire for security overcomes the commitment to justice. Legacy: how Salem changed American justice forever. The Salem Witch Trials ended in 1693, but their influence on American law, culture, and collective memory has lasted for more than 3 centuries. The trials stand as one of the defining events in American history, a dark moment that shaped how Americans think about justice, individual rights, and the dangers of mass hysteria. The most immediate legal legacy of the Salem Witch Trials was the rejection of spectral evidence. After the trials, courts in Massachusetts and throughout the American colonies refused to accept testimony about invisible spirits or visions as evidence in criminal cases. This was a significant shift in legal procedure. It established the principle that criminal convictions should be based on tangible evidence that can be examined and verified, not on subjective claims about invisible phenomena. This rejection of spectral evidence contributed to the broader development of evidentiary standards in American law. The trials demonstrated the danger of allowing convictions based solely on accusers' testimony without corroborating physical evidence. Modern American legal procedure reflects this lesson in numerous ways. The requirement for physical evidence in criminal cases, the exclusion of hearsay testimony, the rules against evidence that is more prejudicial than probative. The Salem trials also influenced the development of the presumption of innocence and the high standard of proof required for criminal convictions. The ease with which people were convicted and executed in Salem, based on testimony that the accused could not effectively refute, horrified later generations. American law developed strong protections for the accused: the right to remain silent, the right to legal representation, the right to confront accusers, and the requirement that guilt be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. These protections did not emerge solely from the Salem experience, of course. They developed over centuries through English common law and through American constitutional law. But Salem provided a powerful cautionary example of what happens when the accused lack adequate protections. When the Founding Fathers drafted the Bill of Rights, the memory of Salem was part of the historical context that shaped their commitment to protecting individual rights against government power. The Salem Witch Trials also contributed to the separation of church and state in American legal culture. The trials had been driven in part by Puritan theology and by ministers who claimed religious authority to interpret events as evidence of witchcraft. The disaster that resulted helped convince Americans that religious belief should not determine criminal prosecutions, that theology and law should be separate spheres. By the time of the American Revolution, the idea that someone could be executed for the crime of witchcraft seemed barbaric and absurd. The United States Constitution, ratified in 1788, contains no reference to witchcraft or to religious crimes. The First Amendment, adopted in 1791, explicitly prohibits the establishment of religion and protects freedom of religion. While these provisions had many sources, the memory of Salem contributed to the American conviction that government should not enforce religious orthodoxy or prosecute religious offenses. Beyond specific legal doctrines, the Salem Witch Trials established a template for thinking about injustice in America. Witch hunt became a metaphor for any situation where innocent people are accused of imaginary crimes or where mass hysteria leads to persecution. This metaphor has been invoked repeatedly throughout American history. In the 1950s, during the anti-communist investigations led by Senator Joseph McCarthy, playwright Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible, using the Salem Witch Trials as an allegory for the persecution of suspected communists. Miller's play drew explicit parallels: unfounded accusations, guilt by association, demands that the accused name others, careers, and lives destroyed by mere accusation, and an atmosphere of fear that prevented effective opposition. The Crucible became one of the most performed plays in American theater and a staple of high school English curricula. Generations of American students have learned about Salem through Miller's dramatization, absorbing the lesson that mass accusations and persecution of unpopular groups represent a recurring danger in American life. The Salem trials have been invoked in discussions of many other historical episodes: the Japanese internment during World War II, the Red Scare and Hollywood blacklists, the persecution of LGBTQ individuals during the Lavender Scare, the panic over satanic ritual abuse in the 1980s, and various moral panics about threats to children. In each case, those concerned about injustice invoke Salem as a warning. We are in danger of repeating history, of allowing fear to overcome reason, of destroying innocent people based on unfounded accusations. The invocation of Salem has become a way of calling for restraint, skepticism, and protection of individual rights. However, the metaphor of the witch hunt is not always used appropriately. Political figures accused of genuine wrongdoing sometimes claim they are victims of a witch hunt, implying that the accusations against them are as baseless as accusations of witchcraft in 1692. This rhetorical strategy attempts to delegitimize investigations or prosecutions by comparing them to Salem. The comparison is rarely apt. Real crimes are not equivalent to imaginary witchcraft, but the metaphor retains such power in American culture that it continues to be deployed. The physical sites associated with the Salem Witch Trials have become places of memory and tourism. The city of Salem, Massachusetts has embraced its dark history, somewhat controversially. Salem is now known as Witch City, with numerous museums, monuments, and tourist attractions related to the trials. Every October, especially around Halloween, Salem attracts hundreds of thousands of visitors interested in witches and the supernatural. This commercialization of tragedy troubles some historians and descendants of the victims. They worry that the Salem Witch Trials have been transformed into entertainment, that the real suffering of the accused has been buried under tourism and kitsch. The image of the witch has been domesticated and made cute, with broomsticks and black cats and pointed hats, erasing the horror of what actually happened in 1692. But Salem has also made efforts at more serious commemoration. In 1992, on the 300th anniversary of the trials, a memorial was dedicated to the victims. The Salem Witch Trials. Memorial consists of stone benches inscribed with the names of the 20 executed victims, set in a small park adjacent to the old burying ground. The memorial provides a space for quiet reflection, distinct from the commercial witch attractions elsewhere in the city. Descendants of those executed in the witch trials have formed organizations to preserve the memory of their ancestors and to advocate for accurate historical understanding. The Nurse Homestead, where Rebecca Nurse lived before her arrest, is maintained as a historic site. The Proctor family and others have worked to ensure their ancestors are remembered not as witches, but as innocent victims of injustice. Scholars have studied the Salem witch trials extensively, producing hundreds of books and articles, analyzing the events from historical, legal, psychological, sociological, and cultural perspectives. Each generation of scholars brings new questions and new methodologies to the study of Salem, ensuring that our understanding of the trials continues to evolve. Recent scholarship has emphasized the Native American context of the trials, noting that many of the accused and many of the accusers had experienced violence during King William's War, the conflict between English settlers and native tribes supported by the French. Some historians argue that trauma from these conflicts contributed to the accusations, with people projecting their fears about native attacks onto imagined witches. Other recent work has examined the role of gender in more nuanced ways, exploring not just why women were accused, but why women were also the primary accusers. Some scholars suggest that accusation was one of the few forms of power available to women and girls in Puritan society, and that the afflicted girls used this power to gain attention and influence in a world that normally silenced them. The Salem witch trials continue to fascinate because they combine multiple elements that capture the imagination: the supernatural, injustice, tragedy, mystery, and moral lessons relevant to contemporary concerns. The trials raise questions that each generation must answer for itself. How do we balance security and liberty? How do we protect communities without persecuting individuals? How do we distinguish genuine threats from imagined ones? How do we prevent fear from overwhelming reason? The legacy of Salem is ultimately a moral legacy. The trials stand as a reminder of what humans are capable of when fear and certainty combine, when institutions fail to protect the accused, when communities turn against their own members. But the aftermath of the trials also demonstrates human capacity for reflection, regret, and attempted restitution, however inadequate. Samuel Sewall's public apology, Ann Putnam's confession, the legislative acts reversing convictions and compensating victims, all these represent efforts to acknowledge wrong and make amends. These efforts were imperfect and insufficient, but they established a pattern of historical reckoning that Americans have repeated when confronting other injustices. The Salem Witch Trials changed American justice by providing a powerful example of injustice, an example so vivid and undeniable that it could be invoked to argue for legal reforms and protections for the accused. Every American law student learns about Salem. Every discussion of evidentiary standards in criminal law references the dangers of spectral evidence. Every debate about the rights of the accused invokes the memory of innocent people executed on the basis of accusations they could not effectively contest. Salem lives in American memory as a cautionary tale. It reminds us that injustice can happen anywhere, even in communities that pride themselves on their righteousness. It reminds us that sincerity and good intentions are not enough to ensure justice. It reminds us that legal protections for the accused are necessary precisely because accusers often believe genuinely in the guilt of those they accuse. 333 years after the trials, Salem's legacy endures. The names of the victims are remembered: Bridget Bishop, Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Good, George Burroughs, Giles Corey, and the 15 others who died on Gallows Hill. Their deaths serve as a reminder of the costs of injustice and the importance of vigilance in protecting the rights of the accused. The Salem Witch Trials cannot be undone. The dead cannot be restored to life. But their legacy can serve a purpose: to warn future generations, to inspire legal protections, to encourage skepticism and courage, and to remind us that the price of justice is eternal vigilance against fear, superstition, and the too human tendency to see our neighbors as enemies. Salem teaches us that witch hunts happen, that good people can do terrible things, that communities can turn against their own members, and that legal protections are all that stand between justice and murder. These lessons remain relevant in every generation. The witch hunt may take different forms, the accusations may change, but the underlying dynamics remain constant. As long as humans are capable of fear, of certainty, of seeing the world in absolute terms of good and evil, the lessons of Salem will remain necessary. The trials ended in 1693. Their legacy continues into the present and will extend into the future, a permanent part of American consciousness, a dark chapter that we remember precisely so that we will not repeat it. 3 hours ago, you entered Salem in 1692. You witnessed how 2 girls having fits turned into mass hysteria, how spectral evidence convicted the innocent, how 20 people were executed for a crime that does not exist, how 1 man was pressed to death rather than enter a plea, and how it all finally ended when the accusations reached too high, when the accusers named the governor's own wife. But history holds more dark stories. Next, discover the entire history of the Jewish people across 4,000 years, or witness how Rome conquered the world, then collapsed. Subscribe to The Deep Unknown and let history's greatest stories find you while you sleep. Happy Halloween.